somewhere I've put the book. I think I hid it. Hang on. I think I found it. I think I put it away. Like, actually away rather than just... Yes, I did. Okay. I found it. I'm literally head. I'm going to undo my wig before we start. Because otherwise it gets too heavy on my head. Let's see. Shall we? I reckon we could do 10 chapters. Perfect. I reckon we could do up to there. Yeah. Cool. So I streamed yesterday. I'm streaming me reading this book, and the first 2 parts will be up on my YouTube channel by the time that you guys are seeing this on my YouTube channel. The first part is up on my YouTube channel at the time of me live streaming, but I streamed the second part yesterday, and previously on Ghost Bride is the main character went to go see a medium because she was having ghost problems, and the medium told her how to resolve ghost problems, but they didn't necessarily work the first time, so she's trying to make them work. And I'm putting my rings on, so don't mind me. And because she's being visited by the ghosty goat in her dreams, and last time that she dreamt of him, he told her that he'd been murdered, and no other murdered by the man that she's kind of got the hots for. So don't ask me to remember their names because I can't. I think the main character's name is Li Lan, and I think the guy that she likes has 3 words to his name, and 2 words to his name, and the guy that she's trying to be the ghost bride for has 3 words to his name. I can't remember their names though. I really should. So at the moment we're on part 2 of the Afterworld. I'll be reading up to almost chapter 20, or almost, yeah, I'll be reading up to part 3, The Plains of the Dead, today. So let's start, shall we? Grab any food or drink because I feel like this is going to be a long stream. So I have water because I was intelligent this time and actually got water, and I also have a Coke because I got very thirsty last time. Chapter 11. Someone was crying, the harsh sobs like the wheezing of an animal in pain. I opened my eyes to a bedchamber with windows half shuttered against the strong sunshine. Though they must have once been of good quality, there was an indefinable shabbiness about the furniture, despite the scoured floorboards and neatly mended linens. All these things I saw with a hawk-like sharpness I had never experienced before. Every whirl in the wooden beams stood out in relief. Each mote of dust hung in the air like a star. An old woman was huddled against the side of the bed, but it was hard to concentrate on her. My mind seemed to wander, so as though it was constantly being drawn away. The bed was a 3-sided box, and on it was a single cotton mattress, worn to a concave meagreness. I spent a long time examining the stitches that held it together. All this time the sobbing continued until, almost in irritation, I turned my attention back to the old woman. She crouched on the floor, her face buried in the side of the mattress. As she rocked back and forth, she exposed the thin soles of her cloth shoes. As I studied her, I became aware of a girl lying in the bed. She lay unnaturally still, her eyelids furled tight as flower buds. The extreme pallor of her complexion made the gently curving brows and the thick lashes stand out in stark contrast, as though they had been painted with a heavy hand. I wondered what she looked like when she opened her eyes, if she ever opened them, indeed, for it was apparent even from a distance that something was wrong with her. The door opened and a maidservant entered. When she saw the girl on the bed, she began to shriek. Her cries drew an older man with pock-marked skin. From his long robe, I guess he was the master of the house, though he seemed pitiably feeble. He grasped the girl's hands and called her name. Distracted, I was about to turn towards the windows, but the sound of her name arrested me and kept me where I was, watching almost disinterestedly as they tried to revive her. All the while, the people in the room kept exclaiming, "Li Lan! Li Lan!" as though that would bring her back. At length the doctor arrived, shooing away the hysterical maid. He listened to the girl's pulse, prized open her mouth, and examined her tongue. He felt the palms of her hands and the soles of her feet, pausing to turn up her eyelids. Then he said, "She's not dead." The old woman, who had not left her post by the bed, burst into fresh weeping. "What was she taken?" he asked. "What has she taken?" he asked. Painfully, she rose and brought a paper packet of powder to the doctor, along with the dregs of an earthenware cup. He sniffed it, put in his finger and licked it briefly. "Opium," he pronounced, "along with a lot of other things, some of which I don't know. Who gave this to her?" The old woman began some muddled explanation about a medium and other events that I barely paid attention to. Instead, fascinated by the fact that the girl was still alive, I drew closer. If I had paused to reflect, perhaps I should have found it strange that no one appeared to notice me, but it didn't occur to me then. The doctor was delivering his diagnostic. "Keep her warm and feed her plain chicken broth if you can. She may revive, but you should also prepare for the worst." "Are you saying she might die?" asked the master of the house. In answer, the doctor wiped his fingers fastidiously on his sleeve. Then, using the second and third finger of his right hand, pressed hard on the girl's upper lip, beneath the nose. Surprisingly, her eyelids gave the merest flicker. At the same instant, I became aware of a tug at the very fibres of my being. If I were a kite blowing on some errant wind, that feeling would be the sudden jerk of the string catching up to me. "You see," said the doctor, "this is the acupuncture point to revive fainting and nosebleeds. She's taken an overdose that slows her life force drastically, yet there's still some key circulating in her body." "Will she recover?" "She's young and her body may eventually break down the poison, so keep her warm and massage her. Try to see if she can take a little liquid." "Please, doctor, tell me truly, what are her chances?" The older man looked haggard, his eyes wide and glassy. I could see his pupils were dilated as though he himself was taking stimulants. The doctor must have noticed too, for he paused to look at him with a faint expression of distaste. "Let her rest, and tomorrow I'll come back with an acupuncture needles. I don't want to stimulate the Kui until her condition stabilizes, but she may be in this state for a while." As the doctor prepared to leave, he took the old woman aside and muttered, "He's smoking too much opium." She nodded, though I could see her heart wasn't in it. Her gaze kept straying back to the girl on the bed, and after the doctor left, she immediately began to massage her limbs. At first, the girl lay motionless like a beautiful doll, but after about 20 minutes I began to perceive a hint of colour in her face. It was so faint that I wondered whether the old woman could detect it, but an expression of relief crossed her face. Tenderly, she smoothed the girl's hair. "I'll make you some soup, my little one," she said. "Don't worry, Amber will come back soon." As soon as the door had closed behind her, I went over to the girl. I felt intensely curious about her. When I gazed into her face, I had the nagging feeling that there was something important that I couldn't remember. Close up, I could detect the barely perceptible pulse in her throat, the sluggish meandering of blood through her body, and the faint lift of her ribcage. Drawn by some unknown fascination, I placed my hand on her chest. A jolt of lightning ran through my body, burning its way with a rush of memories, images, and feelings. In a flash, I remembered who I was, who all these people were. That was my body lying on the bed. For some moments, I stayed there, frozen in fear and amazement. Was I a spirit now? Frantically, I circled the body. My body, I reminded myself. It was said that when the soul was parted from the body, it could be enticed back. I walked around, peering at it, and wondered whether I could enter through a nostril or an ear, but I didn't seem to have that ability. Frustrated at last, I lay down on it, my phantom form slowly sinking in until it was completely engulfed by my unconscious self. I fit perfectly, yet there was a separation that couldn't be reconciled. But despite my anxiety, I no longer felt as distracted. My spirit must have remembered the cradle of my flesh, the soft murmurings of blood in my veins, and it quieted down like a nervous horse in a familiar stall. When I opened my eyes again, Amber's familiar face hovered anxiously over me. For an instant, I thought I was a child again, sick in bed, but then I remembered. She passed a hand over my forehead, but I felt nothing. It was a crushing disappointment. I called Amma, but she continued to gaze down at me sadly. Li Lan, she said, can you hear me? I brought some broth for you. I'm here, I cried, but to her eyes there was no change. When she propped my body up, I sat up in it as well. Amma brought a spoonful to my lips. Just a little, she said. The fragrance was savoury and enticing, but my body slumped forward and the broth dribbled out. Tears gathered in Amma's eyes, but she kept trying. In desperation, I took up my place inside my body and pretended to swallow whenever she spooned the broth in. At first, it seemed to make no difference, but eventually my body swallowed weakly. Amma was beside herself with delight, and so was I. She cleaned my face with a warm, damp towel, dressed me in fresh clothes, and tucked me in. All this I observed while standing at her shoulder, though she had no heed to my piteous entreaties. When she left again, I followed her out. Contrary to my expectations of the spirit world, movement was not difficult. The only change was that I seemed to have less substance. Soft, filmy things, like curtains, were no barrier to my passing, but denser objects required struggle. I didn't even to attempt walls, not wishing to get stuck somewhere. Other people were imperable to me. When Achin brushed past, the movements of her shoulder pushed me back against the wall. Only my own body seemed to accept my passage easily. Ghosts, it was widely believed, had the greatest difficulty turning corners and could be easily flummoxed by odd angles and mirrors, but they could also slip through cracks and dwindle like candle flames. None of these rules seemed to apply to me, and I wondered whether the fact that I was not quite dead had anything to do with it. Or worse, perhaps soon I would lose this ability to move purposely and would fade away, becoming no more than a wraith blown by the wind. At the top of the stairs, I leaped impulsively, floating feather soft down to the floor below. I was so pleased with the discovery that I was on the verge of running upstairs to repeat it when I heard voices in the courtyard. The air was beginning to cool, and a smell of burning charcoal rose as stoves were lit for the evening meal. I could almost taste the food that was cooking, just as I had tasted the broth Amma had spooned into my body. While that had strengthened me, however, these aromas merely tantalized, leaving me unsatisfied. I made my way slowly into the courtyard where old Wong was talking to Achin. Judging from her red nose and swollen eyes, she had either just stopped crying or was about to start again. The little mistress dead, she said, and she's so young. I'm sure this house is cursed. Old Wong made a sharp sound of annoyance. She's not dead. Didn't you hear the doctor? I mean to give my notice tomorrow, said Achin. I won't work here any more. Go ahead then, said old Wong. Try and see if you can find another job right away. At least you're still fed and housed here. What about you? She asked. Will you leave at the end of the month? Don't know, he said. They need the help. I heard the master is bankrupt. Achin blew her nose. Still paying us, aren't they? I listened to them anxiously, wondering how our household would fare if Achin and old Wong should leave us. At that moment, old Wong turned his head and looked directly at me. A spasm of emotion crossed his face, like a lizard skittering on hot stones. I was astonished. No one else had noticed me at all. I called his name, but he turned away. Be off with you, he said. Go back to where you belong. Obediently, Achin picked up her pan of vegetable peelings and made her way indoors. I lingered, thinking about the words he had used. They almost seemed intended for me, but he didn't acknowledge me at all, even when I stood in front of him calling plaintively. Instead, he marched back to the kitchen, leaving me to doubt that instant of recognition. For the next days, I stayed close to my body, often laying in it in hopes that I could rekindle a connection. Compared to when I had first seen it, my body now looked as though it was merely sleeping. The waxen liceless cast was gone, and it could now eat a little and swallow involuntarily. When helped to the chamber pot, it would obediently void itself. This time I worked very hard on, for I didn't want Amma to be burdened as though I were an infant again. At first I was flushed with this success, but when improvement halted at this basic level, I began to despair. The doctor came back every day. I shuddered to think at how we were paying him, but thankfully there was still some cash from the jewellery I had sold. I hoped Amma would have the sense to sell more, if need be. He administered acupuncture and pronounced himself pleasantly surprised at the signs of progress, which he attributed entirely to his own devices. I've seldom seen such a marked improvement in a patient, he declared to my father. But what about her mind? She still doesn't respond to anything. It's an unusual case, to be sure. Usually the spirit returns first, prompting the physical recovery. What do you think? My father broke in. There were stains on his blue robe, which he had not changed for days. You need to call her spirit back. Who knows where it is wandering now? Since I was standing right beside him, I felt the horrible irony of his remarks. Wandering, indeed. And if her spirit can find its way back, then it should naturally join to the body. There is a strong attraction between the two. This conversation made me more certain than ever that I must do something. Anything. The disaster of my disembodiment had overshadowed all else, but now I feared that in my current form I might be easier prey for Lim Tian-ching and his schemes. And what of his other accusations? I found it hard to believe Tian Bain was a murderer, but I tore my thoughts from him. Even if he was innocent, he was marrying another. I had enough troubles of my own. I had not yet dared to pass beyond the barrier of yellow spell papers that Amma and I had pasted on the windows and entrances. Whenever I drew close, they fluttered wildly through. There was no breeze. I feared that they might trap me, as their purpose was to block spirits. I had noticed that my spirit form wore the same clothes my physical body did, and the food Amma gave my body seemed to strengthen it. That seemed a good sign, in some indefinable way. My spirit was still tied to my body, but I wasn't sure what would happen to this bond if I left the house. As I gazed at my body, wishing I had appreciated it more, I noticed a thin thread hanging in the air. At first I thought it was a strand of spider silk, but it glistened in the sunshine and, in contrast to how solid objects had become for me in my new state, appeared strangely translucent. I put my finger out and felt a tingling hum, like the vibrating string of an instrument. Startled, I drew my hand back. The thread emerged from a corner of the room, and by kneeling on the floor, I saw the glint of brass that was Tonbei's watch behind the heavy almirah. I had been unable to retrieve it since I had flung it to Lim Tian-ching's shade that evening. So long ago it seemed. The fine filament originated from the watch, drifting up to span the room until it was lost in the dazzling sunlight outside. I couldn't understand how I had missed seeing it before, and wondered with dread whether I had become closer to the spirit world. Yet the thread drew me. It held a strange attraction so that I couldn't help sliding my hand along it. Following its path at the window, on an impulse I climbed onto the sill. The thread hummed like a captured bee in my palm. I glanced back at the girl on her bed, her eyes closed and her breathing regular. I knew that Amma would take good care of my body. Then I jumped. Chapter 12. Despite my fears, the spell paper on the window didn't hinder my exit. Instead, I drifted slowly down until I stood in the side alley looking back at our house, the glistening thread still clasped in my hand. When I released my grip, it floated up a little, blowing with the wind like spider silk as it stretched on out of sight. Without it, I might well have lost my nerve and returned home, for never in my life had I been alone outside like this. I started to walk, passing the familiar houses of the neighbourhood. There was hardly anyone about. It was too hot to go visiting, and not late in the morning for the peddlers who went from door to door, selling fresh tofu and buckets of water and live chickens. Now that I could wander around freely, I felt a great curiosity to explore other people's houses and see how they lived, but the thread in my hand reminded me that I had other things to do. I didn't know where it was leading me, but it was all I had to go on. I walked a long way, tracing the thread as it wended its way into a more commercial district. There were rows of shops, houses bright with signboards and banners, so closely built that each one shared walls with its neighbours. A khaki lima, or 5 foot away, the cool, shaded walkway created by the overhanging second story of each shop house, ran in front. Here pedestrians haggled, old men dozed in rattan chairs, and stray dogs sprawled, their sides heaving in the heat. There were various sundry shops, an ironmonger, a kopitiam, an Indian money-lender girdled in his white cotton puggree with 3 wavy cased lines painted on his forehead. When I was a child, Amma would bring me here during the moon festival to choose from the ranks of celluloid paper and wire lanterns, bent cunningly into the shapes of butterflies and goldfish. Afterwards, I would wait while she poured over packets of needles and wooden clogs. As I stood there, surrounded by people hurrying about their business, I could almost pretend that I was merely another passer-by, that I was still safe in my body. Tears filled my eyes. I felt utterly desolate, far from our familiar house and anyone who knew and cared about me. I had been sobbing for some time when I gradually became aware of a beggar approaching me. Beggars were a common sight, but there was an unnatural air about this one. He dragged himself along, so broken down that his ribs protruded through his leathery skin. Even as I watched, a man walked unseeingly through him as though he was no more than a shadow. I shrank back in horror, but the beggar was now so close that I couldn't avoid him. When he lifted his face from beneath a tattered hat, I saw little more than dried skin and exposed bone, the eyes like shriveled fruits in their deep sockets. "Who are you?" His voice was thin and weak, as though there were not enough air to pump through that collapsed ribcage. He seemed so frail that I plucked up my courage. "Can you see me?" His head lolled on his withered neck. "Only from certain angles." His gaze wandered. "You have no smell of death. Are you from heaven?" "You are mistaken," I said. "I'm not a deity." "Give me food, then." His mouth yawned like a grave. "I am starving." "What are you?" I whispered, but I think I already know. He was grovelling now, making weak grabs at the hem of my clothes. "I don't remember. Nobody buried me. Nobody knows my name. Now give," the wretched creature moaned. "Give me but a string of cash to buy something to eat." Overcome with pity and horror, I fumbled blindly at my pockets and found myself clutching a few strings of antique copper coins strung together through holes in their centre. This must have been part of the funeral money that I had burned for myself, but I had no time to think about it, for he pounced on the money with surprising swiftness. Clutching it with skeletal hands, he began to drift dispiritedly away. To my dismay, I saw other shadowy forms begin to gather about him with interest. Even as I watched, 2 more hungry ghosts appeared behind me. One was even more tattered and demented-looking than the beggar I had spoken to. It moved in slow fits and jerks, and I wondered whether in time such creatures simply wore away into nothingness. The other, however, must have been more recently dead, for he pushed forward. "A girl was here, giving money?" I shrank from his furious, unseeing gaze. In life, Steve must have been a corpulent man, for he was only just beginning to show signs of starvation. But when I moved, he gave a shout. "There she is!" I fled down endless alleyways, plunging through the warren of shops. Hungry ghosts seemed to appear from all directions, detaching themselves from walls and fluttering out of passageways. Too late, I realised that I shouldn't have run. If the dead could only see me from certain angles, then it would have been better to stay still. As it was, I found myself far from where I had started. The sun was high in the sky when I stopped at a dreadful realisation. In my flight, I had let go of the gauzy strand that had led me out of the house. For a second time that day, I stood in the road with tears in my eyes. This time, however, I dared not make a sound for fear of drawing attention to myself. The salt stung my cheeks and my swollen eyelids throbbed. Exhausted, I sat on a stone and wiped my face with my sleeve. My feet were sore and I checked them for blisters. It seemed utterly unfair that the spirit should suffer the torments of flesh without having any, but perhaps that was the whole point of the afterlife. Well, there was no point crying. After a while, I began to look around, realising that the road seemed familiar. I had passed this way before in a rickshaw, when I wore my best clothes to visit the Lim mansion, and from here I could also find my way home. For a long moment I struggled with temptation. It would be so easy to return, to slip back into our house, but there was another option, even without the strange thread that had guided me. Since Lim Ting Ching had come uninvited to my house, I might as well as return the favour. Perhaps I might discover something to my advantage. Anything was better than meekly waiting for him to come for me. Although I had been tired, my steps were light and I found I could walk more swiftly than in my physical body. There were a few advantages of my spirit form, though I dreaded to think what a price I was paying. Was I hastening my starvation like a hungry ghost? I dared not think too much about it. The great gates of the Lim mansion were closed, though I could see the winding carriage drive through the ornate ironwork. I tested myself against it, and was relieved to find that I could pass through with some effort. A porter dozen in the noon heat, and the hibiscus blossoms by the gate barely quivered as I went by. as though I was merely some errant breeze. As I approached the house, I was struck anew by its old-fashioned air. Many of the rich were now building mansions in the British colonial style, with wide verandas and open ballrooms like the great houses in India and Ceylon. But the Lim mansion was uncompromisingly Chinese, its walls concealing warrens of rooms and courtyards. I wondered if Tian Brei's new bride would demand renovations, but she'd away from such thoughts. The heavy ironwood front door was mercifully ajar, no doubt to emit a cool breeze. I entered with some trepidation, as I was no longer a guest, but a trespasser and, even worse, a spirit. Averting my eyes from the looming family altar, decked with new offerings and wreathed with incense in the front room, I walked hastily to the inner courtyards. There, amid the cool marble towers and ghostly leaves of potted plants, I came upon two servants. One was the woman who had escorted me to the washroom before. She and a young girl were busy watering the plants and wiping the dust off their leaves. I meant to pass them, but as I approached, the girl started and dropped her pitcher. "Look what you've done," said the woman. The girl was only 10 or 11, and she bit her lip with consternation. Instinctively, I made a movement to help with the broken pieces, forgetting I had no physical presence. "I felt something," she said, "like someone passed me." The older woman looked at her sharply. "You know that Madame Lim doesn't like talk about ghosts." The little maid bent over the broken pieces. "But she's always burning funeral goods, isn't she? Maybe it's his son's spirit come back." "Tch, who would want him to come back?" Intrigued, I hung closer. "You've only been here 3 months. You never met the young master." "Was he nice? Like Master Tianbei?" The woman couldn't resist gossiping. "Oh no, there were times when he could do nothing right, but the mistress doted on him. She couldn't accept it when he died." "Was it sudden?" The girl paused, enjoying this respite from work. "He had a fever, to be sure, but he was just as demanding as ever. And then in the morning he was dead. The doctor couldn't believe it. He even wanted to know what he had eaten the night before, but there was nothing amiss. He ate from the same dishes as everyone at the table, which was a good thing." "For who?" "For all of us, you goose. We might have been blamed for it. Madame was very upset. She wanted to know if anyone had served the young master tea before bedtime, but nobody had, and all because his teacup was missing. He had a Celadon cup, a family heirloom, but we couldn't find it anywhere. The mistress had all sorts of odd notions after his death." "How strange." I could see the little girl's fancy was taken by the morbid tale. "What's strange?" Both servants started guiltily. It was Yan Hong. She frowned at the old woman. "My half-brother died of a fever. I don't like to hear you repeating such gossip." I had never seen Yan Hong look so fierce, so different from the gracious, smiling hostess I remembered. When she turned on her heel, I hurried after her. For the rest of the day, I shadowed Yan Hong as she moved purposefully about the house, at ease in both the grand drawing room as well as the cavernous kitchen. Although she was only the daughter of the second wife, she seemed to command a great deal of respect, often making decisions that should have fallen to Madame Lim. She had mentioned to me that she was merely visiting for a while, but she seemed so at home that I couldn't imagine how they would manage without her. Of Madame Lim I saw little. She looked more ill than before, her feathery voice scarcely audible and her listless manner a great change from a mere few weeks ago. I dared not approach her too closely, afraid that Lim Tian-ching would somehow sense my presence. In fact, I was terrified that he might return at any moment. Despite my earlier resolve, I no longer felt up to confronting him. The rooms with their tiled floors and stiff rosewood furniture, the long dark corridors and hurrying servants reminded me at every turn that I was an intruder. Yet I couldn't quite tear myself away, for I noticed that in contrast to my own home, my presence here seemed to exert some influence. Remembering the oppressive atmosphere during my earlier visits, I wondered whether the Lim household had, in fact, been sensitized by Lim Tian-ching's ghost, for more than one person flinched if I stood too close, and the conversation invariably turned to spirits. This was not a particularly happy realization for me, but there was no doubt that it provided some useful information. I had been following Yan Hong with no reason other than that she was the most familiar person to me, and she had been kind before. She seemed to take her duties as the eldest daughter of the house seriously, despite her marriage, and was firm with the servants, friendly with the other woman, and solicitous of her stepmother. I remembered Emma's tale of how Yan Hong's mother had died to ensure her daughter's marriage, and was surprised that she could be so cordial to Madame Lim. There was no sign at all of Tian Bei. I had to admit that I had been half hoping to see him again, no matter how many times I told myself that he cared little for me and was possibly even a murderer. I couldn't help but think about him. The sight of the lotus pond where we had first met produced a painful sensation, and the sudden chiming of a clock made my heart leap. The more I observed Yan Hong, the more I began to feel that she was under some strain. She was careful to maintain her calm manner in front of others, but when alone she gnawed her lips, an anxious expression stealing over her face. She could scarcely sit still, jumping up to do one task after another. I wondered whether Yan Hong had always been this way, or whether it was a new development. The afternoon whittled away until the shadows lengthened in the long passageways, stealing into rooms and dimming the gay patterns of the Dutch tiles on the floor. My spirits seemed to fail with the dying light, and I was weighing what I should do that evening, when the porter came in and muttered something to Yan Hong. "A man outside the house?" she asked. "What does he want?" The porter ducked his head. "He didn't come close, but he's been standing there for some time." "Why didn't you ask him?" "I thought you might leave if I approached him, but she did say to tell you if anything unusual happened." Yan Hong frowned. "Let me see." As she made her way down the curving drive, her pale kebaya fluttered ahead of me like a moth in the fading light. "He's gone," said the porter as they reached the gate. Yan Hong peered out and shrugged in expiration, but with my new sharp sight I glimpsed a figure standing deep in the shadow of a tree. I could make out a bamboo hat and the glint of silver embroidery on the hem of his robe. With a start, I recalled the stranger who had consulted the medium at such length while Amara and I had waited. Even as I considered this, however, the man turned abruptly and disappeared into the dusk. As we headed back to the house, my heart sank. I didn't want to meet Lim Tian Cheng here, when I felt so weak and defenceless. Even as I hesitated, Yan Hong entered the house, which was now ablaze with lamps. Madame Lim was in the entrance hall. "Where did you go?" she asked curiously. Yan Hong patted her arm. "It was nothing," she said. "I'll join you for dinner in a moment." Madame Lim nodded observantly, but as she turned away, Yan Hong shot her a look of pure, unguarded hatred. Surprised, I followed her upstairs into a bedroom, despite my anxiety about leaving. Bolting the door, she lifted the heavy lid of a wooden chest. It was filled with clothing that she hastily set on the floor. At the very bottom of the chest was a cloth-wrapped bundle. Yan Hong wavered for a moment, then untied the knots, as though she felt compelled to check something. She unrolled a corner, and paused with a sigh of relief. Swiftly, she wrapped it up again, but not before I had a glimpse the discarded rim of a Saladin teacup. Oh. Give me a sec. Chapter 13. I was so surprised that I could hardly gather my thoughts. Why did Yan Hong have what looked suspiciously like Lim Tian Ching's missing cup? There might be an innocent explanation, I thought, for surely only a fool would keep such a thing, and Yan Hong didn't strike me as stupid. But the servant had said it was a family heirloom, and perhaps she couldn't bear to throw it away. I was struck as well by the discoloration of the rim. Celadon was prized for its translucency, and from what I had glimpsed, the cup itself had a fine clear glaze. Even as I speculated, however, I felt an increasing sense of oppression, like an ominous fog rolling into the room. Something was coming. I was sure of it. Fearful, I thought of Lim Ching, or even the border officials he had spoken of. The air became weighty, and my chest constricted. It was the same choking sensation I experienced whenever Lim Ching strayed too long in my dreams. My mouth was dry. I could barely draw breath, feeling that the house itself deeply resented my intrusion. With growing unease, I went to the window. In the deepening twilight, I saw a strange procession of dim green lights. They bobbed eerily as they passed the porter at the gate, though he did not appear to see them. It was then that I knew that they were spirit lights. I raced down the stairs, cutting through the servants' quarters and out through a side gate. My side ached, my lungs burned, but still I ran on, trying desperately to increase the distance between myself and those spectral lights. Terrified, I took turn after turn through a maze of black lanes, until at last the suffocating sensation lifted and I could think clearly again. My mind was racing, my thoughts in turmoil. Yan Hong had just as much of a motive for murdering Lim Ching if it meant depriving Madame Lim of her son to avenge her own mother's death. And her husband was a doctor. It would have been easy enough for her to procure drugs or poison. Even as I considered this, however, I recalled with a sinking feeling that Tian Bei had also studied medicine. He had mentioned that his studies were interrupted, but I had never found out why. A breeze sprang up with the tang of the sea that was never far from Malacca. Opposite, lamps were lit in the small row of shop-houses. Drawn to the comforting clank of pots, I peered disconsolately at the enclosed backyards of these houses, eventually choosing a wooden gate that seemed less sturdy. I struggled to force myself through the tight grain of the wood, emerging finally in a stone courtyard. Large glazed jars held drinking water, and a girl my own age was drawing some into a jug. Balancing it against her hip, she carried it inside. I followed her through a dingy kitchen into a tiny dining area. This was the living quarters of a typical shop house that was built extremely long and narrow so that each lay next to its neighbours like an eel in an eel bed. A family sat around a marble table. There was a father, mother, an old grandfather, 2 little boys, and the girl I had followed. But I was drawn to the aroma of food that rose like a mist from the table. It was a plain meal, soup and pickles, tofu, and a platter of fried fish, the ikan kembong, that were no larger than a child's hand. I was so hungry, however, that it seemed like a feast, but despite my best attempts, the fragrance of the food left me gnawingly unsatisfied. It seemed that I would starve unless someone made a spirit offering to me. Miserably, I crouched in a corner of the room as they ate, envying their chatter and every mouthful of food they ingested. I had been hungry before, but never like this. Old Wong always had a few peanuts or a pinch of melon seeds for me. I missed him right now, and our familiar kitchen with a fierceness that frightened me. After a while, the old man motioned to the girl. "Did you make the ancestors' offering today?" She pouted. "Of course I did, grandfather." He turned and squinted at the family altar. "How about the hungry ghosts? Those creatures? Is not even Quinn Ming?" The old man shook his head from side to side as though there was something in his ears. "Put a little rice out for them." Sighing, the girl got up and scooped some rice into a bowl, setting it on an altar with a brief mumble. As soon as she was done, I ran to the altar, inhaling sharply so that the fragrance filled my nostrils and, thankfully, my stomach. I placed my hands together to thank the old man, though he was absorbed in his own meal. Eventually, lulled by their conversation and the events of the day, I closed my eyes. How strange it was that the spirit could sleep, eat, and rest, yet how else could one account for the quantities of paper funeral food and furniture that were burned to accompany the houses and carriages of the dead? I awoke suddenly to silent darkness. The family had retired to bed, but some noise had startled me awake. Straining my ears, I heard a skittering rustle again. The darkness was gradually broken by a faint greenish light from the corridor, much like the ones I had seen approaching the Lim mansion. Nearer and nearer it drifted, till I felt their hairs on my neck tingling. Petrified, I pressed myself half into a great chest of drawers, hoping for the semi-visibility that had aided my escape from the hungry ghosts. The dim light entered the room and paused. At first, all I saw was the back of a figure clad in old-fashioned garments, the hair elaborately dressed with dangling ornaments. It was a young woman, not as thin as the poor hungry ghost who had spoken to me, but when she turned, however, I saw the slight shrivelling of her features, as though a slow process of mummification had begun. She began to wander around the empty dining room, pausing for a moment at the old man's chair. At the rice bowl offering, she stopped. "Who has eaten this?" The corpse light that enveloped her rippling in agitation. "How dare you trespass here?" Her sharp eyes roved around the room like needles. I raised my hand before my face and was horrified to see that it too emanated a faint glow, not the eerie green that had bathed the woman, but a pale shine like moonlight. Enraged, she swept around the room, finally catching sight of me the second time. Her eyes widened, she examined me. "I thought you were a hungry ghost, but now I see that you're not of the dead. Are you here to call me back?" Perhaps it was only natural, I thought, that each ghost's thoughts instantly flew to his own situation. After all, I myself scarcely forget my disembodiment. "What are you, demon or fairy?" she demanded. Not knowing how to reply, I said, "I'm sorry I took your rice. The old man said it was an offering." "It was on the altar, but for years it has been mine." Despite her initial hostility, she seemed eager to talk. Perhaps it had been a long time since there had been anyone to communicate with. I couldn't tell when she had died, as the fashion in funeral garments remained antique and unchanging. Still, I might learn something from her. "Were you waiting for a messenger?" I hazarded. Glancing doubtfully at me, she said, "So you were looking for me? I'm not ready to go, though." "I'm not sure," I began, but she cut me off. "My name is Fan, of the Louis family. I can explain why I'm still here. You're not a hungry ghost?" "Of course not. By rights I should have gone on the courts already. Did the border officials send you? My business isn't with you." I felt I ought to put her straight before I floundered into deeper waters. She sighed. "I suppose it's silly to expect them to send someone like you. Are you a fairy maiden, then? I've always wanted to meet one. I know they sometimes come from paradise, yet—" She broke off, studying my pyjamas. "I've lost my way. Did you lose your steed too?" "My steed? Don't you have a carriage or a horse? Or maybe your rank is too low?" she said dismissively. "It's just that your clothes— I mean, you're very pretty, of course. That's how I knew you were a fairy." Stalling, I said, "I am but a humble handmaid on an errand." "Oh," she said, "is it a love affair? Because that's why I'm here too." Once she started, it was as though she couldn't stop talking. "I died for love. Did you know that?" "Yes," said the ghost as she folded herself in one of the dining chairs. Unlike myself, she had far less mass, for her sleeves trailed through the wood of the chair, and she was so light that a puff of air would have dislodged her from her perch. It was really very romantic. I still remember when I first saw him. He was already married, of course, but she was much older than him. Anyway, it didn't bother me. "You don't mind being a second wife?" She waved a hand negligently. "I was the one he loved. My father refused, of course. He was only a petty shopkeeper, not good enough for me, whereas my family owned a lodging house near Jonker Street, so when I locked myself in my room and refused to eat, my father said he would ship me back to relatives in China. He bought me passage on a junk through the Straits of Malacca. I think he really intended to marry off to a business acquaintance in Singapore, but there was a terrible typhoon and our ship capsized. Never having learned to swim, I quickly drowned." Fan shook her long sleeves out with a sigh. "If I had known how easy it is to lose your life, I would have treasured mine better." If she only knew how heartily I agreed with her. "Hi, Seb." But I was desperate to discover as much as possible about this afterlife and how things worked. "If you drowned, why are you in this house?" "Hi, baby." Hang on, cat break. Bear with. "Hi, baby. Are you here to hear about the spooky ghost story?" this is my baby. Oh, good boy. He's joining us now for the rest of the story, I think. She turned to me in astonishment. Didn't I tell you? This is my lover's house. The old man? He stayed with his wife and had more children. Still, he dreams of me every night. My father, of course, gave me a funeral and burned offerings, though my lover was never told of this. For all he knew, I had been disowned and become a hungry ghost. That's why he puts out rice every evening. He means it for me. With a sudden anxiety, I wondered whether I would even realise it if my own physical body stopped breathing. What was it like when you died? I saw other souls streaming towards the gateway of the courts of judgment. I was supposed to go too, except I wanted to see my beloved again. Oh, his wife was relieved when I died, I tell you, but I made sure that he still loved me in his dreams. Her laughter was a thin tinkle. Though I've always been afraid that they'll send someone to fetch me, but the time is almost at hand anyway. What time is that? Why, I've been waiting for him to die, of course. He almost did several times. He fell off a ladder once, and another time he contracted typhoid, but now I think the end is near. Do you wish him dead, then? Repulsed by her cheer, I was reminded of the negative influence ghosts were said to be on the living. No, she said in alarm. Oh, you mustn't report me to the authorities. I thought that if he died, then I would wait for him to go together. After all, we've been linked by this. She held out an invisible object pinched together between her fingers. Try as I might, however, I could discern nothing. How odd, she said, for I can see it clearly. It's a shining thread. My heart gave a leap. I've been searching for something like that. What is it? It shows the intensity of your feelings, she said. When I was alive, we exchanged tokens. I gave him a hairpin and he gave me a jade thumb ring that had belonged to his father. Once I was dead, I found that I followed his thread. It led me straight to him. He still has my hairpin in a wooden chest upstairs. I thought about Tianbei's watch and the comb that I had slipped him the day he had come to our house. But how was it that my thread hadn't gone toward the Lim mansion? Perhaps your task is difficult because only lovers can find their own thread, said Fan. Does your thread float in the air? She frowned. The other end is probably at the bottom of the sea with the ring that he gave me, but I manage quite well with this end. If I leave the house, I hold on to it. It's so hard to get around as a ghost, you know. Corners, mirrors, such things make me lose my way, and I'm so light now, I would blow down the street if I didn't have this thread to hold on to. Her words confirmed my suspicions that I was indeed different from the dead in the manner that I could move easily from place to place. Even the hungry ghosts that had chased me had fluttered wildly and dispersed. I don't go out very much anymore, anyway, Fan continued. It's so much of a bother. I'm sure I don't know what ordinary ghosts without a thread like mine do. She looked pointedly at me. Me again. You don't seem to know much about anything. We led a sheltered existence, I said, realising that I had come up with something to satisfy don't mind me. There we go. He said, realising that I had come up with something to satisfy her curiosity. My job was to pick fruit in the blessed peach orchard. Though I felt guilty lying to her, she was enthralled. How very boring. Heaven must be overrated. It was marvellous fruit, I said cautiously. Then it must surely have been the fruit of longevity. If I only had one, I'm sure I could bribe the border officials to be lenient with me. Lim Ching had also mentioned border officials. Where can I find them? I asked. At the gateway, of course. I can see it as soon as I go out. Why don't the hungry ghosts go there? They can't find it, she said contemptuously. What do you expect? They had no proper burial, no prayers, no offerings. They're hopeless. I listened to her with a sinking heart. In the end, I persuaded Fan to show me the gateway. She was reluctant to do so at first, coming up with a number of excuses. Eventually, I managed to winkle out of her the fact that she had not left the house for almost 3 years. I've just been keeping him company, she said with a sly glance. I was suddenly reminded of something she had mentioned earlier. Dreams, I said, thinking about Lim Tian-ching's access to my own dreams. She gave a guilty stare. You said he wouldn't forget you in his dreams. How did you manage that? Fan began to pleat her sleeves again. If I tell you, you must put in a good word for me. I can't promise you that, but I'll try. Uneasily, I thought that if only she knew how desperately I was groping for information, barely even knowing who or what the border officials were. She would hardly bother to waste her time on me, but Fan looked satisfied. Well, I found that if I press this thread into his body whilst he's sleeping, sometimes I can make my way into his dreams. There he's young again, and we're together. Lately, though, his dreams have been getting stronger than reality, which is why I think he's going to die soon. I shuddered. This was almost exactly what happened to itinerant scholars in the novels I had read. A beautiful ghost enticed them into a world of dreams until they wasted away in such a phantom of pleasures. I didn't really understand the rules of the afterworld, but I was certain that they must exist from the conversations from Lim Tian-ching. No wonder Fan seemed fearful of the authorities, but she was already leading the way through the long shop house, passing through the front door with no resistance at all. With my greater mass, it took me longer to catch up. When I emerged onto a street, I stopped in wonder. The dark night was lit with spirit lights. Some were green, like Fan's corpse light. Others were a different colour, like strange flowers that bloomed in the night. Among the crowds of hungry ghosts and other human phantoms were carriages and sedan chairs lit with swaying lanterns and drawn by horses and other scale creatures I had never seen before. There were tiger-headed men and tiny birds with female faces, women with backward-pointing feet mingling with lizards dressed in court robes. The walking trees and enormous glowing flowers must be the plant spirits and minor deities that Fan had mentioned. In amazement, I stared at this parade of otherworldly creatures. Dimly, I could hear the sounds of a busy street, but the noise was muffled, as though it had travelled a great distance, and at the same time I was assailed by the same suffocating sensation that I had counted at the Lim mansion. Retching, I gasped for breath. What is it? I asked. Don't you know? It's the spirits. This is nothing. You should see how many come out on feast days. But I can hardly breathe. She peered at me. That's spiritual pressure, caused by the congregation of yin from the ghosts. I don't know what heaven is like, but the longer you mingle with the dead, the less it will bother you. With horror, I realised that she was right. After all, when Lim Tian-ching had begun to haunt me, I had suffered from this choking sensation in my dreams. Earlier that day, when I had first seen such lights as at the Lim Manor, I had been so overcome that I had been forced to leave. But now I was able to talk to Fan without any particular effect, though perhaps her long-dead spirit was more insubstantial. I braced myself against the wall until the intensity began to subside. This in itself was probably a bad sign, but there was nothing I could do about it. And there is the gate, she said, pointing upward to a brightness in the sky. Faintly I could make out a great arch through which a host of spirits streamed in like endless rivers of light, but it was so far away. How do you get there? I asked. You float, she said. Can't you feel the pull it exerts? I'm sure that if I climbed on a roof and let go, I would drift there. I don't think I can float like you. Fly then, she said. Isn't that how you came from the heavenly realm? I was saved from having to reply by sudden commotion. Make way! Driven by these cries, the crowd surged like a wave, beating them back with four monstrous creatures with the heads of belligerent oxen joined to the bodies of men. Each carried a halberd and wore a black uniform with scarlet edging. With snorts and fearful bellows, they parted the crowd easily. Beside me, Fan gave a convulsive shudder. Who are they? I asked. Frantically, she motioned me to be silent. Behind this escort came a blood-red palanquin. There was something about the ostentatious trappings that seemed familiar to me, and I pressed forward, hoping for a closer look. The shutters were drawn, but an errant gust of wind blew them inward. Impatiently, a plump hand battered them back, but not before I had seen its owner. There, sitting at ease within, was Lim Tian Ching. "Where you going, handsome?" I'm going to lean against my bed. Hang on. Bless you. I cried out in amazement and started forward. In that instance, though, my voice was lost in the roaring of the escort. Lim Tian Ching's eyes turned towards me as though he alone had heard my cry. Instinctively, I ducked behind a beast with curling antlers. A frown creased his features. In another moment, the entire procession had passed. "Who was that?" I asked Fan. She had been creeping back towards the shop house, but I forestalled her. "Those were the border officials," she said. I blanched. I had been hoping to find some sort of bureaucrat to appeal to, but these monstrous creatures were beyond my comprehension. Fan looked uneasy. "Well, those were the only foot soldiers, but the border officials are the same type of ox-headed demon. We ghosts try to avoid them as much as possible." "But there was a human ghost in the palanquin," I said. "Then he's probably someone important, or has plenty of money. The authorities can be bribed to an extent, all sorts of privileges. Don't you know that this part of the afterlife is ruled by the judges of hell? Before entering the courts for judgment and reincarnation, there's a place called the Plains of the Dead, where you're allowed to enjoy the funeral offerings that your family burn for you. It's only for human ghosts, though. You can't stay forever. I have a little house there and a couple of servants, but I haven't gone back in a while." Despite herself, a shiver ran through Fan's frame. "Why not?" "I told you, my time is up. I was supposed to report to the gateway and have my case processed for judgment a long time ago." A stubborn look crossed her face. If my father had only burned more funeral money for me than I could bribe with the border officials, I hope that when my lover dies, his family will burn a great deal of cash for him. I've been watching them for years, and they're very fond of him." "Won't you need to report to the courts eventually?" "Well, certainly, but that may not have to be for a long time. Centuries, if we have enough money." I looked doubtfully at Fan. "Don't look at me like that," she said. "Didn't you see that ghost in the palanquin? He's proof that you can do what you like if you have the resources. Now, are we done?" I watched as she slipped back through the shop house door. I hadn't particularly liked her, yet she had a pathos that made me pity her scheming. Still, something she'd mentioned stirred me. Studying the darkened doorway, I had the impression that Fan was still waiting, pressed against the other side. I walked over and addressed the silent facade. "Just one more thing," I said. "How do I find the Plains of the Dead?" There was a faint gasp, then Fan's pale face reappeared, floating upon the surface of the wooden door. It would have frightened me badly before, but I had been accustomed to such sights. "How did you know I was there? You really are a fairy maiden after all." "Where are the Plains of the Dead?" I repeated. Somehow the place seemed to draw me. My thoughts flew, unaccountably, to my mother. Amma had always been so certain that she had been spared the torments of judgment and long since been reborn, but I could not help wondering if she was still there. "There are entrances all over the place, like the gateway. The hungry ghosts can't go there either. They have no clothes and no money for the journey. They can't even steal, as spirit goods must be given freely." "How do you go?" "I told you, I have a couple of servants. When I reach the plains, I call them and they come and carry me." "Could I go there?" She gave me a long look, suspicion struggling with curiosity again. "Why do you need to go, and how will you cross the plains?" "Perhaps you could give me a ride?" "Certainly not. My servants are frail and rather rickety. They're beginning to fall apart after so many years. But if you have money, you can purchase your passage." She looked hard at me. I turned out my pockets, revealing a few strings of cash and a couple of small ingots. "You'll need more than that," she said, with a barely concealed snort. Inwardly, I cursed the fact that I hadn't finished burning all the funeral money before Amma had stopped me that day. "I tell you what," said Fan. "If you wish to go to the plains of the dead, I'll show you the way. For a price. I thought you were provided for." "Just barely. I don't want to meet my lover looking like a beggar when the time comes." "Don't you see him in dreams already?" "Dreams? I can manipulate the setting a little, but when he dies he'll see me as I am. Come, don't you think this is a good bargain?" I thought it over and nodded. "But you need more money. Ask your heavenly authorities. Remember, we'll have to buy horses, wagons, and clothing. And how will I find you when I need you?" She shrugged. "I'm always here, but hurry. I'm afraid that you won't live much longer." I had asked Fan about the plains of the dead. On an impulse. Chapter 14. I had asked Fan about the plains of the dead on an impulse, thinking of my mother, and also that if I were really desperate, it would be one place that I could surely find Lim Tian Ching, hopefully without a demon escort. After all, Fan had said the plains of the dead were for human ghosts, and had I not witnessed firsthand his mansions and parklands, horses and stables in my dreams? Now that I had an alternate theory of his murder, with Yan Hong as a suspect, I might be able to persuade him to abandon his vendetta, though, to be honest, my prospects seemed bleak. I wasn't sure how to persuade anyone to burn funeral money on my behalf. As I went further away from the shop houses, the number of spirit lights began to decrease. I wondered whether there was any significance to the roads, most utilised by ghosts, some underlying meaning or ancient penchant for certain areas. In the meantime, I took care to avoid being seen by other spiritual denizens. The tales I had heard as a child suggested that there was far more terrifying things abroad than what I had just witnessed. Before I realised it, I came upon the old statues, squats and squares, painted a deep red with heavy masonry walls and a sloping European roof. It was a reminder of the times when the Dutch ruled Malacca. I had never been inside, but I knew the British still used it as government quarters. We're doing a scene change. Oh no. We're fine. Everything's fine. This is definitely going to plan. Is that better? Maybe? Yeah, it looks better. Now you can see my face on rather than sideways. I'm going to charge my phone. Okay. The locals said it was haunted, and despite myself, I drew back with a prickle of fear. I looked around for spirit lights, but in this quarter there was none. Perhaps they were all inside, those stolid Dutch burghers and their wives in ancient crinoled splendour, all still pacing the massive beamed floors and fretting over the trading prices of pepper and nutmeg, cinnamon and cloves. The town square lay in front, rigidly planted with flower beds in the Dutch tradition, and punctuated by a fountain. Water gleamed in its still basin and reminded me of my sore feet. I went cautiously over to look into it. Oh, baby! As I bent over the basin, I became aware of another image reflected next to mine, a hazy shape that resolved into an old man wearing a rumpled blouse. He was worn so thin that in the moonlight he was a creature stitched out of fine white lace. "Who are you?" I whispered at last. The old man stirred. "Ah, I see you now." The pale light illuminated a nose like a parrot's beak and deep eye sockets. A foreigner, I thought. I had never been so close to one before. "You are not dead, but neither are you truly living, you poor creature." He was the first spirit who had seen clearly what I was, and I drew back, frightened. "I won't bite." No, I won't. "What are you doing here? You should go back to your home." Although his accent and appearance were strange to me, he spoke in a kindly manner, and it was this, coupled with exhaustion, which brought tears to my eyes. There, he said. "Stop crying. You can hear me, can't you?" Mutely I nodded. "A little Chinese girl, I see," he said. "Begging your pardon, a young lady. Who are you?" "Me? Old Willem Gansevoort, that's who, just sitting by the fountain as is my wont." "You are a Dutchman?" I said excitedly. "I was a Dutchman," he said. "Now I am what? A spirit? A soul? Why are you here?" "I should have asked you the same question," he said in a mild reproof, "but their ladies will have their way." He gave me a stiff but courtly bow. As he did so, I noticed that one of his arms was crippled, clutched to his chest like a fledgling's wing. "I shipped out to the Orient when I was a young man, trained as an architect. That was my profession. Ah, yes, my arm," he said, noticing my gaze. "Born with it, died with it. Nobody thought I could ship out from Rotterdam with this arm, though it was good enough to see the world with. But I always loved Malacca the best, and so when my time was up, I stayed a little longer. I like to look at my handiwork, I suppose." "And what was that? The stud toys?" "Oh no, bless me, how old do you think I am? The stud toys were built in 1650. I am not quite of that vintage. I helped make that small addition, however." I peered at the darkened building, but couldn't make out what he was pointing at. "Very nice," I said, at last. "You think so? Of all the buildings I designed, I like it the best. That little addition was nothing much, but I was very pleased with the way it came together. But where might you be off to?" I opened my mouth, then stopped. I was tired of talking, tired of walking, and finding no rest. I wasn't even sure of this Dutchman, though he seemed harmless enough, and so insubstantial that I was quite convinced of his great age. A faint smile broke across his face. "You don't trust me. I suppose I can hardly blame you. I myself didn't speak to another ghost for quite 50 years, and that was my own prejudice. We did not mix so much with the natives in my time, you see, and the only other Dutchman around was that lunatic who killed himself by jumping off the clock tower. Time has mellowed me, however. Besides, it is lonely not to have anyone to talk to." The idea of lingering for centuries induced a state of near panic. "I'm looking for the Plains of Dead," I said. "The Plains of Dead?" he said. "I cannot help you. I cannot find such a place at all, although I have often heard it mentioned. Those are not my beliefs, my child. That is not my afterworld." I was silent for a moment. "But you can see me. You can talk to me." Yes, of course. We are still very much in the living plane, and you also see these cobblestones beneath our feet, and the moonlight shining on this fountain. This is not really the afterlife, my dear. It is merely the very tail end of living. From here we all go on." "So what happens to your kite when you die?" I asked. "Do you know, I am not entirely sure, but my dear mother taught me that there is a merciful God, and that is what I choose to believe. Either that, or I shall simply fade away." "How did you know what I am?" "Because I saw one such as you a long time ago, an Indian boy who fell from a tree. The fall didn't kill him, so he lingered for a while." "How long?" "Only a few days. He couldn't eat, you see, and when his heart stopped beating, he finally became a ghost. Poor creature, he was so frightened." "Does that mean that I only have a few days too?" My voice shook. "I don't know, but you seem stronger than he was. Your body must be stable, but take good care of it, unless, of course, you are ready to journey on." Despite his kindly manner, his words frightened me more than anything I had encountered that night. "Is there no way for me to return to the living?" I asked. "There may be. There, don't fret. Pray that all will be well, and I will pray for you too." He sighed, and for a time we were silent. A faint line of light appeared on the horizon. "Perhaps you should return to take care of your body," said the Dutchman at last. I'm not sure how to get there from here." "That I may be able to help you with," he said hesitantly. I described our neighbourhood. "Ah, the merchant quarter," he said. "It has been a long time since I ventured there, but it is not difficult to find. Here is how you go." He knelt, using his good arm to trace a map on the patch of earth. None of his gestures made the slightest mark, but the faint after-image left by his ghostly hand I was able to understand his directions. "And if I take this road instead?" I asked. The fresh light of dawn began to flood the town square. I turned to look beside me, but the old Dutchman was gone. I did not know what happened to him, whether he had finally disappeared, his fragile form evaporating under the bright gaze of the sun, or whether he was so ancient that he could only be seen by moonlight. As it was, I sat there disconsolately for a while. Birds were chirping, and mist lay above the night-chilled water in the fountain basin. I found that I was weary, so weary and heartsick that I went and lay down beside the stadstees like any beggar on the streets. When I got up again, the sun was high in the sky. I set off hastily, suddenly full of anxiety for my body. The Dutchman's directions had been good, clear and concise. He had somehow impressed the overall pattern of the town upon me, and soon I found myself in familiar streets. My steps quickened as I drew near our house. Then I stopped short. Standing squarely in front of the door there was an ox-head demon. Head lowered, it stood with folded arms. The heavy bovine head lolled forward in an attitude of boredom that would have been laughable in a less ferocious creature. Frantically, I pushed back into the wall, feeling the resistance as I forced myself into the brick. My thoughts were whirling like a storm of paper fragments. Why was it here? And why hadn't I felt the same warning sense of oppression I had experienced before? I could make the excuse that it was only one demon, whereas last night the street had been full of spirits, but I couldn't fool myself. My awareness was dimming. Every encounter with the dead drew me closer to them. I felt sick. The demon stood motionless, like a figure carved from a massive tree trunk. There is a kind of wild ox called the seladong in the Malayan jungles, which stands taller at the shoulders than the height of a man and weighs more than a ton. A seladong is one of the few creatures that can kill a tiger. I had never seen a live one, but once at the Chinese apothecaries there had been a set of sweeping horns brought in by a hunter. Now, looking at the ox-head demon, I guessed that its tines were even larger than the ones I had seen, but the face beneath them was no mild animal countenance. There was a mixture of cunning and ferocity in the red eyes, a man-like glitter that made me shiver. As I watched this unwelcome doorkeeper, another demon appeared around the corner. "Any news?" said the first. "All clear. Did you go in?" "Too many spell papers. Besides, only her body's left." My pulse fluttered a frantic moth. The thought that such creatures were looking for me made me feel faint with terror. "You stick around for a change. I'm going on patrol." They switched places with grunts and a clash of armour. "Don't let her slip by you." "Speak for yourself." "Still, I don't understand how he knew she was gone." "Never had to post a guard before." "No idea. Suddenly last night he's in a froth. 'Is she still there?' he says, all mincy and twitchy." I pressed the knuckles of my hand against my mouth. So Lim Ching had, indeed, heard my cry of surprise last night. I almost bit off his head to stop his squealing. They exchanged a red-eyed look. "Don't bother. If he doesn't complete his task, he's ours anyway. Not that he knows anything about it." The other demon yawned, displaying a gaping maw and a set of razor-sharp teeth. "What should I do if she comes back?" "Why, make sure she doesn't leave again, of course. She'll come back. They all do." "And her body?" "The old woman's doing a good job. It should last. Nothing wrong with the body." "What if she doesn't come back?" "Gets lost, you mean? Then her spirit will shrivel up. Even if she does come back, she won't fit anymore. Be like a dried bean rattling around in a pod." "Best find her then." The first demon strode away as its replacement settled in front of the door. My stomach clenched. I couldn't go back into the house now. Better to remain at large, I thought, as I waited for the demon to relax its guard. It seemed more alert than its predecessor, however, and stood upright. Scanning the street and the houses around, I was beginning to wonder what to do when the front door opened. Chapter 15. I watched the heavy door swing open with dismay, fearing that whoever came out would fall prey to the waiting demon. I was terrified that it would be Emma, but the figure that emerged was none other than old Wong, our cook. Despite my anxiety, his intersection with the ox-headed demon was oddly anticlimactic. They avoided each other in a strange little dance, old Wong obliviously clutching his basket under one arm, and the demon stepping aside with bored contempt. As old Wong trotted down the street, I wrenched myself loose from the wall, heaving backward into the neighbour's courtyard. In my haste to keep up, I found myself blundering through other people's houses, forcing myself through walls and other obstacles. Old Wong moved onward at a steady clip. From time to time I feared I had lost him, but at last, when we had come to far away from the house, I emerged just in time to see him disappear around a corner. As I hurried after him, I wondered what I meant to do. I had no real plan, no course of action in my mind, yet I remembered that brief instant in the courtyard when he had seemed to recognise me and wished there was some way in which I could increase the visibility of my form. If only it were to rain, the falling drops might show a faint outline, but despite the frequent tropical storms that drenched Malacca, the sky had been clear for the last 2 days. The huge cumulus clouds, like whipped froth, gliding serenely in the sky like floating islands. I caught up with Old Wong and called out to him, though with little hope that he would hear me. To my surprise, he turned his head. Astonishment flicked across his face, but he set his gaze forward as though he hadn't heard me at all. "Old Wong!" I cried again. "It's me, Li Lan!" I darted around, but he studiously ignored me. "Please, if you can see me at all, help me." We walked in thus for a little way. I pleaded while he paid me no heed. A muscle twitched in the corner of his eye, but otherwise he behaved as though I didn't exist. At last I stood in the street and bawled like a child, the tears leaking through my clenched fist and my nose dribbling unceremoniously onto my blouse. "Little miss," Old Wong was looking at me with resignation. "I shouldn't talk to you. Go back to your body." "You can see me?" "Of course I can see you. I've seen you wandering around the house the past week. What are you doing here so far from home?" "I can't go back. There are ox-headed demons guarding the house." I spilled out the tale of my misadventures, sobbing from sheer relief. Old Wong broke into my recital. "Don't stand in the middle of the street. People will think I'm mad." There was an enormous rain tree by the side of the road, its filigreed branches casting a fine network of shade. Old Wong squatted at its foot and said, "Now, what is the matter with you?" As I unburdened myself, he took a twist of newspaper out of his pocket and shook out some toasted melon seeds. "I really shouldn't speak to you," he said from the side of his mouth. "Why not?" He made an impatient noise. "Because it's bad. It will tie you to the spirit world. You need to go back to your body. Why else do you think I pretended not to see you before?" "I've tried," I said. "I've really tried, but I can't rejoin my body, and now I can't even go home." "You say there's a demon guarding the house? You didn't see him?" "No, but I sensed something. I can't see demons. That's something I'm grateful for." "Why is it you can see me then?" "It's a long story. Do you really want to hear it? Aya, you were always one for stories, even when you were a little girl." He sighed as he cracked the melon seeds between his teeth and extracted the sweet kernels. Ever since I could remember, he had always had some kind of snack on his person, from shell peanuts to roasted chickpeas. Despite this, he remained as lean and scrawny as a stray dog, his forearms knotted from the efforts of rolling out dough, butchering chickens, and scouring pans. Old Wong wrinkled his brow. "I can see ghosts. Have been able to since I was a boy. Some people are born with it, others acquire it through spiritual practice. In my case, I didn't realise for a long time that many of the people I saw weren't alive. I was born in a small village up north, in Parak, Tulo Canton, where the British have mining concessions. My father was a cobbler. My mother took in sewing. I never told you that, did I? I didn't want people here to know too much about me. When I was very young, there was a child that I used to play with by the river. Every day he waited for me, and we would busy ourselves playing with sticks and leaves. He never touched anything, just told me what to build. Finally, I asked my mother whether I could bring him home for dinner, for he looked thin and hungry. She didn't believe me when I described him, saying there was no such boy in our village, until I took her to the river and pointed him out. It was then that I realised that he was a ghost, for she couldn't see him. In fact, she was quite frightened, and I got real thrashing. I can tell you, I was told never to play with him again. Later, I gathered from the bits and pieces that I overheard from the adults that there had been a child lost years ago. He had wandered away one day, and his parents, being migrant workers, had no idea where to find him. Nobody ever heard of the family again, and the child was forgotten. Because I insisted that he was still by the river, my parents concluded that the child had drowned. One day my father went to the riverbank without me and made a funeral tablet for the child, since they knew his name, and burned offerings to him. I never saw the boy again. After that, my parents cautioned me not to talk to ghosts any more. But you did a good thing, I said. Old One spat out the shell of a melon seed. Yes, but that was an unusual case. They knew his name and his family. Most of the dead are unknown, and none of them since have spoken to me. I'm talking to you now? Old Wong frowned. You're not dead yet, and you shouldn't talk to just anyone who sees you anyway. There are many evil things abroad, many ghosts who mean harm to the living and will try and trick you. I shuddered, thinking about Fan and her protestations of love for the old man. Who taught you that? Aya, after the incident, my mother couldn't sleep for worrying about me, and in a way she was right to be fearful. My eyes had been opened, and I realised that many of the people that I had taken for granted were probably ghosts. Every day I saw them, the woman in the deserted fruit stalls with nothing to sell, or the one-legged man in the back of the Kopitium. He often laughed for no reason, and I had never understood why nobody paid attention to him. Now I realised it's because they couldn't see him. One day a travelling fortune-teller came to our village. He performed tricks with the aid of spirits, but it was easy enough for me to see through his effects. When he discovered that I could see ghosts, he wanted to buy me from my parents. My mother refused, but after the fortune-teller left, she was afraid that he might come back and steal me. That was when she sent me to a temple to become a novice. And did you stay there? Old Wong snorted. What do you think? I'm sitting here next to you, aren't I? I ran away so many times that in the end the abbot said he wouldn't have me any more. But while I was there, he gave me private lessons. Maybe he thought he could train me to become an exorcist. He was the one who told me how to deal with ghosts. Much good that did, however. After my experience with the child by the river, I never wanted to have any more to do with them. Because it was frightening? No, because it was too sad. Most of them I couldn't help, and had no interest in making money off them. You could see I shirked my duty, but I was always in the temple kitchens anyway, so in the end I ran off and became a cook. And your family? It was better for me to leave. There was always someone asking me to see ghosts, grant favours, or do mischief for them. I just wanted to be left alone. I thought about how dismissive old Wong had always been towards our maid Achin's hysterics and could not help laughing. What's so funny? No wonder you never believed Achin's stories. Old One let a grudging smile escape. That girl, I could have told her far worse things than she imagined. Did you ever see a ghost in our house? Once on the main staircase. He made a face and said abruptly, But never ye mind, the old master had an exorcist brought in. Only much later would I understand the significance of his words, but at this time I was more anxious to ask, Did you ever see the ghost of Lim Tian-ching? He frowned. No, but you can say he came in your dreams at first. He must have some other link. All I can tell you is that he never bothered to come to the kitchen. Also, I don't look for ghosts. I try not to see them or pay attention. It's the only way I can live my life. To see spirits is a taint, not a talent. He fell silent, while I thought for what a fixture old Wong was in our household. How strange to think that he had kept this uncanny ability buried beneath the surface of his everyday life. Old Wong, can you do something for me? I asked at last. What? I hope that you're planning to come home with me now. I can't do that, but can you make me an offering of spirit money or food? He sighed. I don't like to do that. It strengthens the ability of your spirit to stay in the other world. I think you should come back to your body now. What good is it if I'm Lim Tian-ching's prisoner? Please, give me a little time to find a way out of this. But I have no ancestral tablet to make offerings to you. Just write it on some paper. Little miss, I cannot read or write. I was crestfallen, and he saw my disappointment. I'll buy you some food that you can take directly, since you're here with me, and then later maybe I'll ask your father to write you a funeral tablet, though he won't like it at all. That's if he's still lucid. I felt a rush of guilt. How is my father? Not good. I'm sorry I can't give you better news. And Amma? Busy taking care of your body. That's her whole focus these days. She wanted to bring in some medium from the Sampo Kong temple, but your father absolutely refused. They had a terrible fight about it. I'm telling you, you better come back soon. Despite this worrisome news, it was a strangely pleasant occasion. I tagged along beside old Wong, just as I had done when I was a child, and could come and go more freely. We passed an itinerant noodle seller with a pot of steaming soup at one end of a carrying pole, and a basket containing a small brazier and various ingredients on the other. Squatting in the street, he set up his portable stove and cooked noodles to order. I had always wanted to try some, but Amma would never let me. "Can I have noodles?" Old Wong looked indignant. "Don't you know that they never wash the bowl and chopsticks, but simply pass them along to the next customer? I can make you far better noodles than that." "But I can't go home right now." "Do you want to get sick?" I couldn't help smiling at the absurdity of this. "You don't know," he said darkly. "No noodles for you." Then he relented. "Further on there's a Luxor stall. We'll go there, not this kind of dirty place." We entered a narrow alleyway where canvas awnings were stretched against the sun, and hawkers hunched over charcoal braziers. A narrow gutter filled with foul-smelling water ran through it. Amma would have said it was no place for a girl of good family, as the diners consisted of mainly men, both coolies and other townsmen. Old One picked his way past the noisy diners packed together at communal tables. Narrow counters were piled high with glossy prawns, tangled noodles, and mounds of red chilies and fresh cilantro. Fried fish, yellow with turmeric, and crispy begiddle, a meat and potato croquette, were laid out on green banana leaves, while satay and stingray rubbed with chili paste were barbecued on charcoal grills. I was so hungry that I felt faint. Old Wong hurried straight to his stall with a line of waiting customers. When his curried laksa arrived, Old Wong presented it to me with a mumbled prayer. Then he picked up his chopsticks and began to eat. To my relief, once it had been dedicated, I was able to savour the spicy noodles swimming in their curried broth. Puffs of fried tofu, bean sprouts, and plump cockles were buried beneath like treasures. Once replete, I chatted gaily as I followed him around, forgetting my sorrows for a while. Old Wong bought bananas and bean paste buns, remembering they were my favourites. I told him I wasn't hungry, but he said it didn't matter. "You may find you can eat them later." I nodded, remembering the funeral money that had appeared in my pockets. "I have no more money on me," he said. "Are you sure you can't come back to the house? Not as long as the demons are guarding it. But what will you eat in the meantime?" Touched by his concern, I turned my face away, unable to speak. We were almost home, and Old Wong asked me whether the demons were still on guard. I glanced around, annoyed with myself for unthinkingly following back, but there was no sign of them. "I better go," I said. He opened his mouth as though to say something, but I left swiftly, afraid to draw attention to him. Is it telling me who's watching? Oh, nice. Chapter 16. As I was now back in familiar territory, my thoughts flew again to the shining thread that I had followed out of my bedroom window, and which I had lost while pursued by the hungry ghosts. I searched up and down the street, retracing that earlier route. Just as I was about to give up in despair, I caught its faint gleam with overwhelming relief. Once I had regained it, however, I stood irresolute. If this thread truly led me to Tian Bei, should I seek him out at all? Despite my new suspicions of Yan Hong, it was he that Lim Tian Ching had named as a murderer, and on top of everything, he was preparing to wed another. Yet I yearned to see him. Foolishly, perhaps, I felt that if I could only look into his eyes again, I would know whether Lim Tian Ching's accusations were false. After all, there was a history of rivalry between them, and if I could only discover Lim Tianqing's secret task and who was behind it, I might have a better sense of whether his vendetta had just cause. I didn't wish to become like Fan, trapped for decades in the orbit of her lover's life, yet the longing to see Tianbei one more time, to find out whether this marriage was his own desire, was hard to resist. In the end, I gave in. As I trotted along, buoyed by a good meal, my spirits began to rise. The thread in my hand led me away from the walled mansions of the wealthy, through the commercial district and out towards the harbour. The distinctive corrugated sails of Chinese junks came into view, mingled with the white sails of European schooners and a low flotilla of Malay prahus, with painted eyes on their bows. Beyond them lay the Straits of Malacca, the turquoise waters clear as glass and warm as bath water. From here ships came from Singapore and Penang, unloading their bales of cotton, tin, and spices on the bare backs of coolies like a never-ending procession of ants. With no one to censor me, I was tempted to dip my toes into the waves, but the thread tugged me to the right. Fine as it was, it had a sturdy strength, and its faint hum grew a little higher, like the hunting call of a female mosquito. The road wound down to a row of warehouses where cargo was stored before it was loaded into the waiting ships. Our family had once had such a go-down when my father still engaged activity in trade. I still remembered the excitement in our household when one of his ships came home with a fine cargo and profit, but those days were now only a distant memory. The road petered out into a dark path, packed with the feet of coolies and rutted by ox carts, ending at a large warehouse. The heavy doors were barred, but the thread led me to a shipping office to the side. All was quiet, and the very air, soft with the smell of the sea, shimmered in the afternoon heat. Inside it was dim and cool, plainly planked with wood that had weathered grey from the sea air, and empty save for a table with a solitary abacus. I guess this was where the overseer tallied boxes and paid off coolies, but the thread in my hand began to vibrate insistently, leading me through to an inner office stacked with shelves of ledgers and boxes of shipping records. A long window faced the sea, and ranged upon it still was a curious collection. Pieces of coral lay next to a dismantled brass clock, the tooth of a whale, and a beautiful little horse carved of sandalwood. At the very end of the ledge the thread terminated at a woman's hair comb. I knew at once that it was mine, the one that I had pressed into Tianbei's hand. A flat sense of depression overcame me as I regarded the objects on the window-sill. What had I expected? That Tianbei would be clutching my comb on his person, just as I obsessively carried his watch? Fan had said the glittering thread conveyed strength of feelings, but what if it was only a one-sided attachment? Perhaps it was fitting that my comb lay upon the ledge, the last in a line of trophies. Doubtless the choir girl had given him something better to remember her by. Tears of disappointment lurked treacherously in my eyes, but I rubbed them away. Turning to the window I sighed, and was startled when I heard another sigh close by. In my haste I had barely glanced at the other side of the room, which was sectioned off by screens. Now I walked around to discover that they concealed a washstand and a cot bed. On the bed, fast asleep, lay Tianbei. One arm was thrown carelessly over his head. Even as I watched, he shifted and frowned. The sturdy column of his neck and the flat muscles of his chest gave him a vigour that made me curious about what he did when he wasn't sitting at a desk. I brushed my hand against his forehead, but there was no response. Fan had said she could enter the dreams of her beloved using her thread. I too had one, and wondered whether I dared to use it, but my feet were already crossing the room to retrieve it. Plucking the thread between my fingers, I pressed it into his chest. There was a slight resistance, nothing more. Then the world around me swelled and became grey and cloudy. I stood on the edge of a cliff, overlooking a harbour. The sea was a sullen green, the surrounding peaks blue and misty in the fading afternoon light. Wind shredded the clouds, and the air was cold and strange. The bay, deep and curving with numerous inlets, held schools of ships far beyond Malacca's capacity. There were tea clippers, steamers, and so many junks that the harbour was dotted with their fierce, fin-like sails. As I looked around, marvelling at this foreign land, I found that I was standing next to Tianbei.
I must have entered his dream, but what was he dreaming of? The wind blew unceasingly. The shapes of mountains were new to me. Compared with Lim Tian Ching's flat invasion of my own dreams, there was a vivid clarity to everything. But perhaps that was because he had manufactured a setting in. In Tian Bei's case, I was sure that this dream was a memory, and that this could only be Hong Kong's Victoria Harbour. I had seen black and white lithographs of its long channel and the dramatic peaks that sheltered it, but had never imagined I would ever see such a sight myself. For some time I could only stare transfixed, until the sight of Tian Bei's profile recalled me. Tian Bei stood a little apart from a group of sightseers who were dressed in a mixture of Manchu and Western clothing. He himself wore a jacket of grey broadcloth with covered buttons, matching waistcoat and dark trousers. His hair was already cut short in the Western style. They were speaking Cantonese and English interchangeably, but I could understand every word, perhaps because what he heard and saw, I did too. One young man seemed particularly close to Tian Bei, and I guessed that he must be Yan Hong's husband. He was short, with impish narrow eyes. The others, clearly fellow medical students, laughed in his remarks. The women stood a little apart. I was very interested in their clothes, particularly the boned and wasting warped costumes that nipped in their silhouettes and arched their backs. It was the first time I had seen Chinese women wearing European dresses, and I suppose that in Hong Kong such attire was fashionable, and the weather cool enough to dress this way without inconvenience. Eagerly, I studied their hairstyles and jewellery, wondering how they pinned their hair up. As I did so, I noticed a girl who did not look quite Chinese. She was about my age, with a distinctive, almost foreign appearance. Her heavy-lidded dark eyes and creamy complexion with olive undertones reminded me of orchids grown in the shade. As she turned to the woman beside me, I noticed three small moles in the pale skin of her neck. It soon became apparent that Tian Bei was watching this girl. His eyes would rest on her, then swiftly glance away. Despite my own fascination with her, I couldn't help feeling the sting of jealousy. Yan Hong's husband came up beside him and laid a hand on his shoulder. "Is this your first time seeing the beautiful Isabel?" he murmured. "Better not let her brother catch you. He's just over there." "What was their family name again?" asked Tian Bei. "Souza, an old Portuguese Eurasian family. But don't think about it." His grip tightened on Tian Bei's shoulder, then abruptly let go. "Come, we're leaving," he said. Absorbed by the events unfolding before me, I now remembered with a start that my purpose was to talk to Tian Bei. I concentrated, telling him urgently, "You can see me. You can." Obediently, he turned his head with an expression of confusion. "Li Lan, what are you doing here?" He stared beyond me at the group of people, now frozen as though time had stopped for them. "I must be dreaming," he said. In almost perfect accord, the world around us began to ripple and dissolve. Realizing that Tian Bei was beginning to wake up, I thought desperately of the office I had found him in. The harder I focused, the clearer the image became. As Tian Bei looked around, adding his belief to it, it solidified until it was indistinguishable from the real room, down to the open window and the faint sound of the sea outside. Tian Bei was lying on the cot, and I was standing beside him. "Li Lan," he said again, "I heard you were ill. Some said you were on the verge of death." He sat up, rubbing his face. "I must have been asleep. How did you get here?" I was too happy with the success to speak for a moment. This was far better than I had hoped. I could only stammer, "Yes, I was sick. They said you were poisoned. Are you truly better now?" I'll move you again. How could I answer him? Questions flitted through my mind like a swarm of butterflies. Oh, there we go. I am a professional live streamer, you can tell. Questions flitted through my mind like a swarm of butterflies, but like a fool, I could only blurt out, "Are you getting married?" "What?" "I heard from my father that your marriage contract had been signed already." "Is that why you were ill?" I crossed my arms. I took some medicine given by a medium. "Why were you consulting a medium?" In my daydreams I had imagined that Tianbei would understand my situation immediately, that he would instantly grasp my difficulties and somehow deliver me from the peril I was in. But to my dismay, his questions only served to emphasise the gap between us. Watching the frown that had flitted across his face, I had no idea how to begin, and wished I hadn't blundered onto such topics. I was ill, so my amma suggested it, but it didn't seem to help much. That at least was no lie. I wouldn't put too much store in mediums, said Tianbei. My aunt is everly fond of consulting them. Because of her son, I said. A shadow passed over his face. His death was a great shock to her. And you? Do you miss your cousin too? Tianbei gave me a level look. Not in the least, he said. Chapter 17. I stared at him, trying to read his expression. I couldn't imagine why he would tell me such a thing, unless he was bent on confessing his misdeeds. Or perhaps he really was as frank and open as his countenance had always suggested. How well did I really know him anyway? It's a terrible thing to say, he said, but we never got along. He was jealous, and I wasn't very kind to him when we were younger. You know my father was the eldest brother? I heard. You should have been. Well, you are the rightful heir to the Lim family, are you not? I said. It seemed beyond the bounds of good taste to talk about other people's private family matters, but I had to press on. Yes, but I was a child when my parents died and my uncle took over the business. Surely it was cruel of your uncle to deprive you of your inheritance. You don't understand. My uncle loves me, you see. My surprise must have shown on my face. From servants' gossips, as well as the treatment of his father, I had no warm feelings towards his uncle. Tianbei cast a swift glance to me. My uncle can be difficult, but he has his virtues as well. I think Lim Ching would always sense that his father preferred me and resented it bitterly. My uncle was caught between us, as well as the wishes of his wife. Madame Lim seems like a complicated person. I chose my word carefully, hoping that he would stay on topic. You can't blame her in some ways. She loved her own son dearly. I often regret I wasn't around when he died, and that she was the first one to find him. You weren't at home? Hope was rising in my chest. I was up at Port Dickson, inspecting a ship. I turned away to hide my mounting relief. Lim Ching must have lied to me. I remembered old Wong's warning not to trust ghosts. Surely, however, I could not trust Tianbei. I wanted to believe him so much. Does this prospect of a ship please you so much? I could hear the smile in his voice without turning around. If you like, you can see one today. Yes, I replied, without thinking, forgetting that I would have to conjure up a convincing ship. At the door he paused. But I meant to ask, how is it that you're here? His gaze flickered down to the plain house clothes that Amma had dressed my body in. I hesitated. If I told him the truth, he might shrink from me as a wandering spirit. My Amma is waiting outside, I said. Worse and worse. I couldn't possibly manage an imaginary Amma as well. Maybe another time? Perhaps you're right. After all, he stopped and had the grace to look awkward. The marriage, I said in sudden comprehension. You're to marry the daughter of the Kwa family. Li Lan, Tianbei reached out and grasped my hand. To my surprise, he caught hold of it instead of slipping right through my immaterial form. I kept forgetting that we were in a dream world, and in this place he believed that I was just as alive as he was. I felt a tremendous sadness, even as the warmth of his hand, the first human touch I had experienced for a long time, seeped into mine. Don't be sad, he said, misunderstanding me. I didn't arrange that marriage, and I haven't yet agreed to it. But my father said the contracts were signed already. Not but my hand. My uncle wishes it, though. What will happen if you don't agree? Then he'll disinherit me. Is the marriage so important, then? I said in dismay. If Lim Ching had lived, this would have been his match, not mine. The Kwa family has certain trading interests that dovetail with ours. And if he had lived, would you have married me? I couldn't help a note of wistfulness from my voice. Lim Ching seemed to always be between us. Do you need to ask? But you hardly know me. I knew of the arrangements before I left for Hong Kong. Was it made so long ago? I was surprised, for my father's rambling account had been vague about this misunderstanding. T and Bay drew closer. They talked about it when we were children, or perhaps I should say, when you were a child. I must confess that initially I was a little concerned. You were only 7 when it was first mentioned. I tried to pull away, but he tugged my hand back. There I was, almost 16, and they said I was betrothed to a little girl in pigtails, but later I did some asking around of my own. And who did you ask? That would be revealing my secrets. He smiled at me, and I was caught. His eyes darkened, their gaze intensifying. Breathless, I was acutely aware of how close he stood. Tianbei tilted my face towards him, running his hand down my neck and shoulders. His hand was warm and dry where it trailed across my skin. I could feel the heat rising from his body through his thin cotton shirt.
Thank you!
The skin of his throat was so near that I could reach out and press my lips against it. His hands, firm and smooth, were sliding up my back. I closed my eyes, feeling his breath hover against my eyelids, his lips barely brushing them so that I could feel their warmth. When they reached the corner of my mouth, he paused for a moment. I had been holding my breath, and now it exhaled, my lips parting involuntarily. Tianbei pressed his mouth against mine. Amazed, I could feel the warmth of his lips, the moist heat of his tongue. He kissed me, slowly at first and then harder. My heart was pounding, my hands caught in the thin fabric of his Why, Seb, why? Okay, apparently we're having a break. Because this one wanted attention. I'll get back to reading in a second. Are you okay? Huh? Seb? Yeah, the reason that I called down is because my dad called up saying that there's a cup of tea on the stairs for me. So I should probably go get that. I will take this one with me. It's so cute. I'm gonna leave him there. And you guys can see him whilst I go get tea. I'll be back. Oh, no, he's coming with me. Ah! Okay. Hello. I'm back. Hopefully Seb will come and join us again. My door is open, so hopefully he'll come in. On a really intense bit as well. Hopefully he'll come back. It'll be fine. Anyway, let's get back to reading, shall we? I'm gonna have a sip of tea because I can. Where are we on? Then he let me go. You should go home. It would ruin your reputation if you were discovered here alone with me. I was overcome with embarrassment, so flustered that I hardly knew where to look. Tianbei looked stricken. It does no good to do this, not for you or me. I suppose you better defer to your uncle's wishes. The words came out more bitterly than I'd meant. My uncle has his ideas, but I have no intention of deferring to all of them. For the first time I heard the flint in his voice. The open expression that gave his face such charm disappeared, and I was surprised at how distant he looked. And what do you propose instead? I knew the weight of family opinion in such matters. It seemed hopeless. My aunt, in fact, doesn't support the marriage. She feels it's too painful to see her son's match be given to another. He's dead, I said dryly. Of course. The atmosphere between us was suddenly strained. Tianbei fingered a small wooden horse, exquisitely carved in every detail. I longed to ask him more questions about the marriage, but had no grounds to object. I couldn't even bring myself to tell him that I was, if not dead, then almost dead myself. I feared he would recall me, and I dreaded to lose this moment of physical contact, dream though it might be. I should go, I said at last, although I had no wish to do so. It was just that I had no idea of what to do next. How could I ask him to burn hell money for me or buy paper funeral goods? The thought made me feel even more disconsolate. There's just one thing, I said. Please, promise me you'll do it, even if it makes no sense to you. What is it? Can you dedicate a drawing to me? The doctor said that I should have someone draw a picture of a horse or a carriage and burn it in my name. He frowned, but I hurried onward, unhappy with my own deception. I know you don't believe in such superstitions, but it would help my situation. Anything you like, just a picture of some kind of conveyance, or even a donkey. And I'm to write your name on it? What is this supposed to accomplish? I heard the sceptical note in his voice and thought rapidly. It's supposed to carry off my illness, but my father won't permit it at home. My halting explanation worked, for his expression softened. Of course. Why didn't you tell me? Immediately I felt terrible. Why didn't I tell him the truth anyway? But I feared that he would give up on me, consent to the choir marriage if there was nobody else to marry, just a shell of girl lying on a bed in a darkened room. I didn't know it at the time, but I was so bitterly regretted this decision. It was so difficult to leave Tianbei, but I told myself that I would return as soon as possible. Far better if this dream ended so that he would believe that it actually occurred, for I needed him to burn some form of transport for me, so that I would be able to journey to the plains of the dead. But perhaps at our next meeting. My mind was already leaping ahead, imagining another, less modest scenarios. I remembered the feel of his hands on me, the heat of his mouth. Once again I thought of Fan, and began to understand how she might have frittered years away on this kind of dream life with her lover. As it was, it took a great deal of willpower to sever our connection. I concentrated hard, imagining that Tianbei saw me enter rickshaw with a silent hammer. Then I left him with the thought that he had lain down on the cot again and fallen asleep. Leaving the warehouses behind, I began to walk desultorily along the shore, although my thoughts kept returning to Tianbei. I couldn't help feeling angry with myself. I had failed to tell him how things really stood. I was a coward, or perhaps my daydreams that he would instantly understand. We were simply naive. Still, I was drawn to him. I didn't know if this was love, but it made me tremble, both elated and afraid. I wondered if he felt the same way, and how many other women he had kissed. My skin recalled the sensation of his hand as it slid across my shoulder blades and up my neck, and I had the sudden image of the 3 small moles in Isabel Souza's pale nape. The sound of waves and the cries of gulls grew louder as I picked my way through the coarse salt grass. The Straits of Malacca faced due west, and the sun was beginning to set, hovering over the waters and turning everything to pure and brilliant gold. A few enormous clouds hung in the sky like the islands of an enchanted land. Below, on the sands, fishermen dragged their wooden boats in and spread their nets to dry. It struck me, if I could penetrate Tianbei's dreams with the filament composed of the strength of my feelings, did that mean that Lim Ting-ching had such a thread too? I recalled how Madame Lim had requested the ribbon from my hair when I first visited their house, Though it must be a one-way connection, I thought of how weak and unstable the link had always seemed, and was grateful that he didn't seem able to find me anymore. With a start, I realised that the fishermen were now far behind. Grabbing a coaster, don't mind me. Beside me was the fringe of coconut groves, and farther ahead, where the sand ended, the dark mass of mangroves that grows in its roots into the salt water. I had never been so isolated from humans in my life. Even wandering the streets of Malacca, I had been aware of other people's busy about their own affairs. Now I begin to consider what other spirits might emerge from the night. There might be were-tigers in the jungle, and other dark spirits, like the blood-sucking Palong or the grasshopper-like Pelicet, who could always see me. Fear seeped into my heart, and I turned back into the darkening sky. As I scrambled down a sandbank, I saw a figure standing at the water's edge. It wore a broad-brimmed bamboo hat and a robe with hem-silver thread. With surprise, I realised it was a young man who had been consulting the medium before me, and if I were right, the same man who had been standing outside the Lim mansion the previous evening. There were far too many coincidences about this. Emboldening in my invisibility, I began to make my way down the culvert, sliding into the crumbling sand. Although I was certain that I made no sound, he abruptly strode off at a great pace. Looking back, I have no good explanation for my actions. I really ought to have retraced my steps, perhaps returning to Tian Bei's office to retrieve the thread that I had forgotten. Foolish. I should have asked him to keep my comb upon his person so that I could easily find him again. These thoughts skittered through my mind like a lizard running through long grass, even as my legs, moving as though they had a will of their own, went stumbling and skidding off after the man in the bamboo hat. He moved away from the shore towards the low mass of mangrove trees. I hoped that he would not go into the mangroves themselves, for they grew in sulphurous mud. Their roots raised them above the sea-water and provided a buffer between the land and the sea. I had passed a mangrove swamp on one of our childhood drives to the countryside, and I had never forgotten its putrescent smell, nor the strange fruit of the trees precipitously growing a pointed root, while still attached to the branch, so that when the fruit fell it would instantly root itself in the mud. As the man strode along, I openly hurried after him, confident that he couldn't see me. At the edge of the mangroves he stood, his head with its peculiar headgear swept from side to side as though searching for something, though I could still caught no glimpse of his face. Feeling uneasy in the open, I slipped into the shadowy tangle of the mangrove trees. The mud supported my light form so that I could walk on the surface as though upon a thin crust. On an impulse I climbed a tree. Given my lack of mass, it was surprisingly easy, and soon I found myself lying far out upon a branch that would not ordinarily have supported a monkey, gazing down at the stranger. Now that I had the leisure to examine him, I was struck by the eccentricity of his garb. With the exception of some adoption of Malay clothes, most straight-born Chinese with a high-collared costume of China, though strictly speaking this attire wasn't Chinese at all. My father had told me a little of this history, and how the Manchus, a non-Chinese race from the north, had conquered China and forced their new subjects to adopt Manchu clothing, including the male practice of shaving half the head and braiding the rest of the hair in a queue. There had been great resistance to this, for the Chinese men felt it was shameful to shave their heads. Public executions, however, ensured that the antique dress of Han China was now almost never seen. The man in the bamboo hat was wearing Han clothing. That is to say, he wore a robe tied across over, the left over the right and bound by a broad sash. Beneath it he wore loose trousers and boots. I recognised this garb because it was used in books, paintings, and historic plays. In fact, the thought crossed my mind that he was perhaps an actor from some operatic troupe, and if so, I might have wasted my time on a fool's errand. The sun dipped into the darkening sea like an egg yolk slipping from its shell, and I began to worry about finding my way back to town. But if I stayed with him, I could at least follow him back,
for surely he didn't mean to spend the night out here. It was a good thing that I didn't move from my hiding place, for I had hardly come to the conclusion when there was such a loud rustling. Branches broke underfoot, and I was struck by a burned, kerosene smell, as though someone had put spoiled meat upon a brazier. I lifted my head up from where I had pillowed it in my arms and peered down. There, standing not 10 paces away, was an ox-headed demon. I was so startled that I nearly fell out the tree. Had it tracked me all the way here? But the demon paid no attention to my hiding place, and I quickly realised that its business was the man I followed. "So you've come at last," he said. It was a surprisingly pleasant voice. Low, yet mellifluous for a man. Certainly not what I expected from the stranger who would behave so boorishly at the mediums. The ox-headed demon inclined its head. I had never been so close to one of them before, and was terrified that it would see me through the thin screen of leaves, but it never looked up. "I was delayed," it said gruffly. "I had a hard time getting away." "Never mind that. Did you find anything?" "Plenty of conjecture, but no hard evidence." "That's not good enough. Begging your pardon, sir, but I think we can build a case." "Building a case isn't the same as winning one. There must be records, transactions." The demon snorted and rolled its dreadful eyes, yet it remained silent. My mind was working feverishly. Who was this man who consorted with demons? My attention was caught by his next words. "So Lim Tianqing is proceeding well with his tasks?" "If you mean proceeding as he wishes, then I suppose the answer is yes." "And with those of the court? The directives were not very clear." The man paused for a moment. "Much to Lim's advantage, no doubt?" "Yes, but if you check the official records, I knew what the official records say. There is nothing untoward in them." "Anything else?" "The girl has gone." The man nodded. "I know. Tell me something else." "He has given orders to recapture her if possible." "The girl is a distraction, but she may yet prove to our advantage if he is occupied in that direction." "Then I should continue with my surveillance?" "Yes. We'll meet again at the usual place and time." The demon lowered its great horned head, the wicked tines glinting in the fading light. Then it sprang away at great speed. I heard once again the sound of vegetation being broken and crashed, but could no longer see it. Only the faint roasted stench remained. I remained frozen on my branch, trying to make sense of this peculiar conversation. There was no doubt that my fate was involved, but how, and who were these people? I peered at the man below again, but he remained a cipher, his entire head hidden by the wide bamboo hat. With the onset darkness, however, I began to see a faint glow about him, the slightest shimmer of a spirit light. I hugged the branch tighter, wondering whether I dared follow him to his next destination. After all, he hadn't noticed me earlier. I had just worked up enough courage to begin sliding down the tree when the man spoke again. "You can come out now." Having tea. Bear with. I do that a bit more. If I lean here, I'm more central. Right? Chapter 18. There was no escape for me. Mortified, I jumped the last 10 feet, landing softly on the sand. That at least I was thankful for. If I had fallen into the swamp, it would have been the final humiliation. The stranger stood with his arms folded, his face still shielded by his bamboo hat with its curiously large and turned-down brim. "You know I was there all the time?" I said at last. He cocked his head to one side. "If you want to follow someone, you ought not to do so at such a paintingly close range." "Stung," I said. "I didn't know you could see me." "Of course I could see you." "But you didn't say anything." "I was wondering what you were planning to do. Beg for clemency, perhaps?" "Why should I beg you for anything?" "No, that seems like a logical thing to do." "I don't even know who you are," I cried in frustration. "Or what you are, I suppose." "Ah, the risk of going incognito."
The beautiful voice turned ironic. It had a clear, rippling quality that was mesmerizing. "Never mind," he said. "I suppose I gave you too much credit for disconcertment. After all, you've been following me. There must have been some reason for that." "I've seen you before." "The medium, I suppose, and at the Lim mansion. I wondered whether you remembered." My annoyance got the better of me. "If you really want to remain incognito, then you ought to change your clothes." "My clothes?" And that ridiculous hat." I caught the gleam of teeth from the shadowy recess of the hat. "The sartorial fault is mine, no doubt, although I must say that your own taste is also suspect." Glancing down at the pyjamas that Alma had changed my body into, I coloured. "Well, let us begin again, then," he said, "now that we've introduced ourselves with the requisite compliments." "I beg your pardon," I said. You may well know who I am, but I still lack the honour of your name." "My name is not so important, but very well. I am Li Lan." Although he said it wasn't significant, there was no doubt that he was expecting some sort of reaction. Unfortunately, I was unable to give him any. Li Lan was the plainest sort of name, if you could call it a name. It simply meant second son. "And how do you know about me?" I asked. "Are you always so impatient?" "I'm just a little anxious. You would be too if someone was discussing you with a demon." A part of me was warning myself not to antagonize him, but I couldn't bite my tongue. Despite his hidden features, I wasn't as intimidated as I should perhaps have been, accustomed as I was to my father's ruined looks. "So you know about the demons? You've certainly been getting around." "They were guarding my house. I could hardly go and hide in my room." Careful, I thought, but he merely shrugged. "Good, you're more resourceful than I thought." "And what does that mean?" "It means that you may be useful to me." I felt myself bristle, just like the fighting cockerels you see for sale in the market. Although trussed by the legs and wings for transportation, the vendors often shake them a little at one another to demonstrate their fierceness. That was exactly how I felt at the moment. After all, I had very little to lose, having no body any more, but I told myself not to be foolish. There might be other things, worse still, that could be inflicted upon the spirit. In the meantime, the stranger seemed to have arrived at some sort of decision. "Come," he said, "let us walk a little." The sea was dark and placid. The moon's faint light was just beginning to silver the sand. The man walked at an easy pace, and we fell in step with each other as if we were old friends going for a stroll. After a while, I noticed that while I made no footprints in the sand, he left a neat, elegant track behind him. That was why I had mistaken him for an ordinary person. When we had walked for some time in silence, he said to me in an almost companionable manner, "No questions, then?" I didn't know what I had leave to ask. Self-control is a quality I've always admired, especially in a woman. "Well then," I said, "who are you really, and why are you interested in Lim Cheng? You're not a ghost, are you?" "As for that, you may think of me as another kind of entity." Amusement tinged his voice. "Perhaps it would be better to describe me as a minor official." "An official in the afterlife?" "Of sorts. What do you know about the afterlife?" Briefly, I recounted what I had discovered from Fan and the other ghosts I had encountered. When I had finished, he nodded, the enormous bamboo hat moving like a shadowy bat. "Not bad," he said. "Quite good work for 2 days." I might have been more pleased if he hadn't sounded so condescending, but he continued in the same cool tone. "The afterlife, as you've no doubt discovered, is governed fairly strictly. There are rules about the passage of human ghosts through this world and on to their next reincarnations." The way he said this made me shudder. Suddenly, I was certain that I was in the presence of something completely foreign to me, not human at all, in fact. I wondered uneasily what he was concealing beneath the hat. "One of the ministries oversees the courts of hell, a safeguard, you may say, to ensure the system is not abused. When you have unhappy ghosts and quantities of hell money floating around, you can hardly expect there to be no corruption." "Are you from heaven, then?" I asked, thinking with chagrin about how I had gone round pretending to be from the peach orchards of paradise myself. "Not at all. Consider me a mere tool, a special investigator, if you will." "And are you investigating Lim Cheng? I see you've put your eavesdropping to good use." Lim Ting has exhibited some rather suspicious behaviours. What has he done? His case has certain indicators of bribery and coercion, part of a pattern that has surfaced recently. In other words, one of the 9 judges of hell is probably corrupt. Oh, they all are, to some degree, he added, but it would be well to discover how serious it is, who is raising money and recruiting soldiers, for when the cycle of violence escapes its confines in hell, it causes earthquakes, floods, and other calamities. Don't you remember the eruption of Krakatoa? Krakatoa was a volcano that had erupted in Indonesia in 1883. I remembered my father's accounts of the tremendous sound of the explosion, and how the skies had turned black for days with the rain of bitter ash. Even though Malaya was far from the Sunda Straits, the lava flow was so intense that the entire island was decimated of all living creatures. Passengers on boats and steamships reported seeing human skeletons awash at sea upon pillows of floating pumice stone, even up to a year after the eruption. Krakatoa was the physical manifestation of a rebellion in hell. Though it was suppressed, not all the conspirators were identified, but if another uprising were to upset the spiritual balance of the world, it wouldn't be just natural disasters that occurred. The moral equilibrium will slip and shift so that nations will turn their thoughts to war. The world may yet burn from China to Europe, and even in the jungles of Malaya. His voice had dropped, as though he was speaking to himself. A cold tendril snaked into my heart, and I was struck by how insignificant my problem seemed in comparison. I was merely one cell cut adrift from its body. What would it be like if there were thousands, or hundreds of thousands like me? An image of the dead, floating like withered leaves on the surface of the water, came to me, and I had the sudden urge to catch hold of Erlang's sleeve. His presence, strange as it was a comfort to me in the darkness. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked at last. When he spoke again, his tone was flippant, as though he were embarrassed at having said too much. "It has very little to do with you, the merest coincidence. It happened that I was interested in Lim Ting-ching's movements, and his interest, apparently, also included you. If you have any special dispensation," I said hopefully, "perhaps you can return me to my body?" "Unfortunately, that is beyond my powers," he said, and the beautiful voice sounded genuinely regretful. "Your dislocation occurred as a result of something you did to yourself." "But it was an accident." "Was it?" he said, and the way he said it made me squirm. "Well, I didn't mean to, and couldn't you say that Lim Ting-ching drove me to it? It's possible you can make a case for it, but that would have to come up before the courts of hell. They may well decide to give you another chance if the ruling goes against Lim Ting-ching. But how would I do that? Gather evidence of his wrongdoing, and then, of course, make sure that you don't get assigned to the wrong judge." "That seems to dovetail rather too well with your own investigation," I said. "Well, if you can find out what Lim Ting-ching is doing, together with some sort of proof, then perhaps I can also help with the direction of your case. He told me that he was murdered, and that he had a task to perform in return for his revenge," I said, unsure about whether to mention the accusation. "But if Tian Bei were truly innocent, perhaps we would clear his name." "Did he now? He's not supposed to be dispensing justice by himself, even if he really was murdered. There's no reason why the court exists. One assumes that you'll go to marriage to him is probably another perk of his obedience. I have my spies, as you've no doubt realised, but they have their limitations." We had turned inland, the path climbing above the beach and toward the trees. The balmy night was redolent with champaca flowers. One or two of those modest blooms can perfume an entire room. A few stars hung low in the sky. I sighed, wishing Tian Bei was at my side instead of his acrobatic, light-footed stranger. I had been studying him covertly and still had no sense of what he looked like. His movements were swift and limber, his form elegant in the old-fashioned clothes that suited him so well, but his face was a mystery to me. Perhaps there was no features beneath his hat, merely a skull with loose ivory teeth or a monstrous lizard with baleful eyes. When we reached the top of the rise, my guide said, For a young woman, you seem to have a rare gift for silence. This wasn't something I had ever noticed about myself, but I didn't wish to puncture his illusions. And are you often surrounded by chattering women? I ventured. He shuddered. I find their attentions very tiresome. I choked on this display of vanity. Unbidding, the imagery of shrieking women fleeting from a monster rose in my mind, but he only said, "So, do you think you can discover what Lim Ching has been up to? And how should I do that? Walk up to his house and tell him I'm ready for the wedding? It's not a bad idea at all. Go to his house, see what you can discover." I stared hard at the darkness beneath the brim of his hat, wondering if he was joking. But the Lim mansion is probably guarded by demons now. True, but that's not what I meant. I was referring to his other house. I was silent for a moment. You mean the plains of the dead? Of course, he won't expect that at all. Why don't you go? Because I can't. The plains of the dead is for human souls, a transitional place that is the shadow of the real world, for without it, the shock from life to death is too great for some. The plains of the dead. From the moment I had heard of it from Fan, I had been drawn to that place. Was it because my spirit was now edging closer to death? But I had very few options left. "I'll go," I said at last, "if it will help my case. But can you give me any aid? Any spirit money or a steed? Those are human goods that I have no traffic in, but I will give you something better." He slipped his hand into his robe and brought out a shining flat disc, tapering to one end like a flower petal. Grasping it, I was astonished to find that it was a scale, but one so large that I could not imagine what sort of creature had shed it. It was about the size of the palm of my hand, smoothly marked with grooved lines from one direction and culminating in a razor-sharp frill on the other edge. In the moonlight it shone like mother of pearl, so glossy it looked as though it was wet, though when I drew my fingers across it, it was perfectly dry. It is a means to call me, far better than spirit money, don't you think? He was so pleased with himself that I had to restrain myself from rolling my eyes. "But you can't go to the plains of the dead." "Well, yes, but there are other areas where I may be of help. I'm sure a resourceful girl like you can easily find a way to the plains." His wry tone made me wonder whether he knew about Fan and her offer to me. "You must hold it up and blow upon the rippled edge, then call my name, and, if I can, I will come to you." To my surprise, we were fast approaching the outskirts of town. Lang had led me to a direct route, cutting back like a bird on a wing. When I glanced behind me at the path we had taken, however, I could no longer see it. All that remained was a dark, sighing mass of trees and the waist-high spears of Li Lan. I wondered whether I had been dreaming. So clearly could I picture the pale glint of sandy soil upon that winding path, but the route behind us looked impassable. "Now," he said, pausing before the sea of roofs below us. Oil lamp burned in some windows, and with my sharp vision I could see the faint misami of green and blue spirit lights in the darkened streets. "Can you manage from here?" I hesitated. "Yes. As for money and a carriage?" I shrugged hopelessly. "You've already done far better than you can imagine," said Erlang in a surprisingly kind tone. "There's one thing more to remember. Time in the plain of the dead doesn't pass at the same rate as it does here. The rate isn't constant. It ebbs and flows, but in general it will be faster than time here. That is how someone may die one night and be reborn the next day, yet have spent months or even years in the plain of the dead. I won't lie to you, there is a certain amount of danger. In fact, I am not even sure you can enter the plains since you're not quite dead yourself." "And if I can't?" He shrugged. "Then we must try another tactic, but I shall remember your service to me, regardless." I opened my mouth to ask him another question, but he forestalled me. "If you manage to go to the plains of the dead, don't trust anyone, and don't eat anything. You still have a living body, which is a great advantage for it strengthens you beyond what the dead are capable of. If I don't eat spirit food, won't I wither away? For if you return to the living, it is better not to dilute your spirit with the food of the dead." "That's what old Wong said." "Who was that?" "Our cook." He waved his sleeve in disdain. "Yes, well, just remember what I said. But I must go now. I have tarried too long, and there are other urgent matters at hand." A dozen more questions sprang to my lips, but at that moment there was a great rushing sound. A strong wind buffeted me,
stirring up the leaves and branches in a whirling maelstrom. I closed my eyes against the onslaught, and when I opened them again, Erlang was gone. Far off in the night sky I saw a streak of light undulating like an eel in the ocean, but it passed so swiftly that I wondered whether I had imagined it. I swallowed the wrong way. How long has this stream been going? Oh, that's a long stream. I think this is the longest I've ever streamed before. Nice. Cool. Chapter 19. I spent the night on the hillside, not feeling up to the task of going into the town and trying to spend my limited hell money on some kind of conveyance. There was an enormous tree with buttress roots rising like low walls, and I huddled against it like a timid palandoc, a mouse or mouse deer. We have many local stories of the mouse deer, so tiny that a man could pick one up and stuff it into a bag with ease. It is no bigger than a cat with the delicate twig-like legs. They are reputedly among the easiest game to hunt, for all you have to do is drum upon some dry leaves with a pair of sticks. Eventually, a male palandoc will appear, thinking it is some rival, and will respond by rapidly drumming its own legs. The hunter then shoots the deer with a blow dart and carries it home for supper. I always felt it was a most unfair way to trap an animal, and not at all in keeping with the mouse deer's fabled reputation for cunning. It's got like a little asterisk thing saying, in Malay tales, Sankanchil, the mouse deer, is a brash and clever trickster. As I hugged my knees, I thought that in the grand scheme of things, I was no more effective than a mouse deer, hiding my defensive self here and there, called out by the drumming of information in dribs and drabs. Was Erlang to be trusted? While he was with me, I hadn't considered it, but now doubt and wariness crowded my mind. In the end, I decided that I would trust him, for now. After all, it wasn't as though I had much else to fall back on. The noise of birds woke me. It was cold, and a pale mist lay heavily upon the grass. From the broken, swaying branches above, a troop of monkeys had passed overhead. At some point, Amma had changed my pyjamas again. Hurriedly, I left out my garments, fearful that the scale that Lang had given me might have vanished, but it was still tucked in my pocket. Last night it had shone like mother of pearl, but in the morning light its gloss was even brighter. The creature that had shed it must have been a marvellous sight, and I speculated anew whether Lang hid the pouting face of a fish beneath his hat, or more frighteningly, the head of a great serpent. Putting these thoughts aside, I started toward the town below. The huge trees gave way to waist-high undergrowth, dense enough to make passing through it a struggle for me. The sun was high in the sky, but I was still far from my destination. I groaned inwardly as I gazed at the way before me. Malaya is a land of perpetual green. Under the hot sun and torrential rains, any dwelling that is abandoned is quickly covered with vines. Any path untravelled reverts to the jungle. All around me rose the monotonous churling of cascades. It was so loud that I didn't hear the clink of a harness until it was almost upon me. Bewildered, I looked around, but there was nothing to be seen. At last, I said timidly, "Is there someone here?" There was no reply, just a soft whicker. I tried again, feeling even more foolish. "Is there a horse here?" When I pronounced the word horse, I suddenly saw it. It was a small blocky horse, the colour of sandalwood. Bright dark eyes, like custard apple seeds, peered from under a thick mane that was plaited into bunches. The horse was gaily caparisoned with a blanket and saddle, and it was these that I recognised, for it looked exactly like the same as the wooden carving Tian Bei had held in his hand. I knew then that Tian Bei had burned it for me. The horses in Lim Tian Ching's grand stables had been static and lifeless, for they were only made of paper. But this horse, carved from a block of wood, moved like a real animal.
There were no words for my delight. I shall call you Chandana, I decided. It is the Malay word for sandalwood, for the original carving had been done in the fine-grained, fragrant wood. Riding her was easy, far easier than a real horse, for she stood docilely while I clambered up, and her broad back was as stable as a rocking horse. Chandana didn't tire, and she neither ate nor drank. We passed swiftly through the undergrowth. The grass didn't even quiver. It was by these signs that I knew that she was more of the spirit world than I was. It was afternoon when we entered Malacca. Now that I had found my transport, there was no reason not to find Fan and ask her to show me the way to the plains of the dead. Feeling cheerful for the first time in a great while, I found my way to Fan's shop house just as the pigeons were fluttering to their nests. At the front door, I paused, wondering whether to wait until darkness. The family was sitting down at an early dinner, and I smelled the tempting aroma of salted fish. "Fan," I called. There was no reply. I squeezed myself through the wooden door with some difficulty. The corridor was lit by the last rays of the afternoon sun, and didn't seem as frightening as it had the other night when I had been led blindly through the house by Fan. I walked up and down, calling her name despite the family who was eating dinner. They, of course, had no idea I was there, though once when I passed close by I thought I saw the old man blink. In the end, having found no trace of her, I made my way back to the front door. While I was contemplating the uncomfortable task of trying to pass through it once again, I heard a faint voice. "What are you doing here?" Peering around, I found Fan at last. She had been hiding in a shadowy corner, pressed into the door of a cupboard. It was very hard to see her in the last glittering motes of sunset. "I came back. You said you would take me to the plains of death." "Oh, I can't possibly go now," she said weakly. "Why not?" "It's not convenient. Couldn't you at least point out the way for me?" She said something unintelligible, then finally realising that I could not hear her, she shouted faintly, "After dark." Not entirely sure of what she had proposed, I nodded and said, "I'll wait for you outside until nightfall." To my relief, Chandana was still where I had left her. I was afraid that someone might steal her, so precious had she become to me in a relatively short period of time, but I remembered Fan's words about spirit items needing to be freely given. Otherwise, I suppose, there was nothing to stop hordes of hungry ghosts from pillaging. As it was, I leaned against her side, inhaling the sweet scent of sandalwood, the precious wood from which incense is made. We waited for a long time. The sharp sickle moon rose, and still Fan did not appear. I began to wonder whether I had mistaken her meaning when she had finally materialised through the front door. From her sullen expression, I suspect that she had been hiding on the other side. As soon as she saw Chandana, however, her eyes lit up. "You have a steed!" I couldn't help a tinge of smugness. "Yes, I'm ready to go to the plains of the dead." "But how is it—" Fan walked around the horse, staring closely. Then she glanced sharply at me. "This is good quality, very good indeed. Did you get one for me? I'm afraid that heavenly dispensation only provided transport for me." "But I'm to be your companion. You should have asked them to provide for me as well." I hesitated. "I'll pay you when we arrive there. I didn't think you wanted the authorities notified about you." "Oh," she looked crestfallen. "I suppose you're right. And didn't you say you already had transport?" "I do, but my servants are very shabby in comparison." There we go. She sighed enviously. "Well, when my lover joins me, I'm sure I shall have a grand palanquin at my disposal." I stifled the urge to roll my eyes, wishing I liked her better. It was difficult to think of enduring a long journey in her company. "Are you ready to leave?" I asked. "If you're not willing, I'll find another guide." Though even as I said this, I wondered how I could possibly manage. "Whoever said that? Of course I'll go. I have some business there of my own anyway. Still, I need to make preparations." She hemmed and hawed, went back and forth into the house several times, but emerged without looking any different. At last, when I was seriously considering riding off on my own, she came out. "Let's go." I noticed then that her fingers were pinched as though she was clutching something invisible, and I guessed that she had gone to retrieve the thread that bound her to the old man. Glancing at me, she said almost apologetically, "I dare not go without it. I would get lost." Immediately, I felt guilty for harbouring such unkind thoughts towards her.
She was, after all, a ghost, and it was true she made her way forward with difficulty. She advanced in a mincing manner, subject to a sudden gust of wind and stray shadows. I followed, leading Chandana by the reins. It was not entirely dark yet. The sky was a still deep blue, but already I could see the soft glow of spirit lights. I felt like hurrying Fan along, but she grew increasingly dithery the farther we went from her shop house. At one point she turned round and round, as though unable to break out of her perambulation. "I told you I don't like to go out much," she said petulantly. "It's so much trouble, and it gets worse as the years go by. I'm losing substance. I know I am." I didn't remind her that it was her own choice to overstay her time in this plane of existence. We crept along at a snail's pace, keeping always to the shadows and avoiding any spirit lights. Fan was terrified of running into border guards, and her nervousness was infectious. "How far away is an entrance to the plains of death?" I asked. "I could have sworn there was one right around here," she said. At last, that was the one I used. Don't tell me that they moved it." "The entrances shift? There are many ways to go there," she said irritably. "Sometimes they move for no good reason." In silence we fumbled around, peering down one dark alleyway after another. I had no idea what Fan was looking for, but when I laid my hand on Chandana's neck, I felt calmer. If I ever returned to my body, I thought I would ask Father to buy me a horse. Thinking about my father and his troubles, however, made me feel gloomy again. My hand crept toward the pocket in which I had styled the scale that Lang had given me. Its hard edge imbued me with a little more resolve. At that moment, Fan stopped. "It is here." I couldn't make out anything except an old doorway in the wall, gaping like a hungry mouth. There was nothing different about it other than the quality of its darkness, which seemed, if possible, even blacker than the gloom around it. Fan passed her hand around the lintel, and a faint red light kindled within, as though the door led to some subterranean passage that was fathoms deep. I didn't like it at all, and neither did Chandana. The little mare backed away, prancing hesitantly. "How do you know?" I asked Fan in a whisper. "It calls to me," she said, turning to look at me over her shoulder. The crimson light cast a faint glow on her face, accentuating the shriveled, mummified aspect of it. "Can't you feel it?" "No," I said, not mentioning that it actively repelled me. Well, Lang had mentioned something about that. Perhaps I won't be able to pass, and for an instant I hoped that I need not go after all. But Fan was already ducking into the doorway. "Come," she hissed. "This is the way to the plains of the dead." And I'm going to stop it there. Because we're now on part 3 in the plains of the dead. So I'm going to stop it there. And I don't know when I'm next going to stream it. But probably sometime next week because I'm busy, until next week. So I will probably put it on my Instagram and my Twitter when I'm next streaming it. And I hope to see you there. And I hope that you enjoyed this video, or the stream. I keep forgetting that it's a stream and not just a video. And I will see you in like a week. Awesome. Bye.